Winterfell's courtyard lay silent under a leaden sky, the clouds gray and brooding like a promise of harsher winds yet to come. A fresh fall of snow coated every rampart, every crenellation, smoothing the edges of the ancient stone into softer curves and forming delicate icicles that glittered along the walls. Jon Snow stood near the gate, one gloved hand resting lightly on the cold stone. He surveyed the keep that had been his home for most of his life, feeling a strange unspoken tension in the air, something he could not quite place, as though Winterfell herself was holding her breath. Only the wind whistled softly through the courtyard, carrying with it the faint sense of pine pitch and the distant tang of wood smoke. Winter was pressing in. The days were short, and the nights were vast stretches of darkness broken by pale moonlight on the snow. There was a hush over the castle that reminded Jon of the earliest memories he had here. Memories of crouching behind walls, out of sight of Sir Roderick's lessons, or lurking in the shadows so he could sneak out at dawn for extra sword practice. Yet this hush was not born of peaceful contentment or childlike exploration. He felt it as a breathless expectancy, as if something under the very stones of Winterfell had awakened from a centuries-long rest. He turned his eyes upward to the tall towers. A swirl of snow fell across his cheeks, and he blinked as it clung to his lashes. He could have gone back inside to the great hall, where a meager fire kept the worst of the cold away, and where Sansa and Arya might be having some quiet conversation. Instead, he lingered in the courtyard, pulled by an indistinct compulsion. His boots, heavy with half-frozen mud, made soft crunching sounds in the fresh snow. Ghost, his albino dairy wolf, paced at his side, quiet as a wraith but entirely alert, ears perked and nose testing the air. Jon found his gaze drawn along the walls, across the keep, down to the crypts that lay beneath. The crypts had always unsettled him. There was a gloom in those corridors of old kings and wardens, and the hush down there felt more like a presence than an absence. A memory brushed the edges of his mind. The first time he'd ever gone down there with his siblings, how they teased each other with ghost stories about the old Stark kings. Now he was older, and so much of his life had changed. But the crypt still gave him pause. The chill air in that labyrinth was heavier than anywhere else in Winterfell, and in the quiet corners, it felt like something was listening. He turned slowly toward the entry that led below. Ghost gave a low rumble in his throat, not a growl but a soft warning, as if he sensed the same subtle current that drew Jon's steps. Jon made his way toward the worn archway. Thick timber doors led to downward steps. He lifted the heavy iron latch, the metal biting with cold even through his gloves, and the door creaked open. A dark corridor lay beyond, lit by a single sconce that flickered uncertainly, sending elongated shadows dancing across the walls. Each footfall on the stone echoed, and the echoes seemed to linger too long. Jon glanced back at Ghost, who followed him with unwavering loyalty, bright red eyes glowing in the gloom. He descended the winding staircase that led deeper under Winterfell's ancient foundations. It smelled of earth and damp stone, a quiet tomb-like atmosphere that weighed on the senses. The deeper he went, the more his heart pounded, not out of fear but out of a tension, a certainty that he was walking towards something. At each landing, he paused. He listened to the silence. He could hear only his own breath, the soft pad of Ghost's paws, and the drip of water somewhere far below. He came to the crypts themselves, where carved effigies of long-dead Starks lay, each with a stone direwolf curled at their feet. The corridor was lined with them, generation after generation, a silent company that bore witness to Winterfell's storied past. Torches sat in brackets along the walls, but only a few were lit, and each flame guttered in some unfelt draft. At any other time, Jon would have found this place reflective, even hauntingly serene, but now it seemed alive with a subdued pulse. He walked between the rows of silent watchers, stone eyes fixed on the endless shadows, names etched on the pedestals below. Ghost stayed close, letting out another soft, almost inaudible whine. Jon felt a faint tremor in his gut. Something was calling him onward, and the further he progressed, the more intense that subtle call became. He realized he was nearly holding his breath. He found an offshoot corridor he had never paid much heed to. An ancient passage blocked by half-collapsed masonry. The Starks of ages past had built many hidden nooks and side passages, partly for storing bones of distant relatives, partly for the labyrinthine expansions that each generation seemed to add. In his youth, no one had told him the full extent of Winterfell's subterranean passageways. Perhaps no one truly knew. Many had collapsed over the centuries, or had been sealed away after the walls above them fell. Usually they were too dangerous to explore. But now, with a strangely urgent sense of purpose, Jon brushed aside old spiderwebs and broken stones until he found a doorway that had half-rotted from centuries of neglect. He tested it, found it stuck. His shoulder heaved against the ancient timbers, and with a splintering groan, it gave way. Cold air washed over him from the darkness beyond, more bitter than any normal winter chill. It felt sharper, purer, a biting wind that did not belong in a closed-off corridor under the earth. He drew his sword, the ring of Valyrian steel echoing off the stone. The blade's faint reflections cast flickers of light on the walls as he stepped through the doorway. His breath crystallized immediately in the air, forming thick puffs of vapor. Inside, the corridor sloped downward with a steepness he had never seen beneath Winterfell. The walls were slick with ice in patches, as if some deep frost had settled over them. Every step he took felt like a step into another realm. He moved slowly, a torch in one hand and the sword in the other. The corridor's descending steps narrow and treacherous. Ghosts' fur bristled, but the direwolf showed no sign of retreating. They continued for what felt like hours, though it might have been only minutes. Time lost meaning in that underworld of cold darkness. At intervals, Jon paused, hearing a low hum as though an echo vibrated from somewhere far below. The hair on the back of his neck prickled when he realized it almost sounded like breathing. A slow, deep respiration of something ancient. When at last the corridor leveled out, the space opened into a vast cavern, though cavern was perhaps too natural a word for it. The structure seemed partially carved, with pillars of ice and stone. The torchlight only reached so far, revealing massive shapes in the gloom. Glittering crystals that reflected the weak flame back 1,000 times. Jon could feel his heart thunder as he took in the eerie sight. The air here was colder than he'd ever felt, colder even than the winds beyond the wall. The slow, resonant sound, like distant thunder, reverberated through the huge space again, and Ghost growled low, crouching with hackles raised. Jon advanced, step by cautious step, until the torchlight revealed the monstrous shape lying in the center of this underground hall. At first, his mind failed to interpret what he saw. A vast, serpentine form stretched across the chamber's floor, partially encased in ice. Great ridges, like shards of frosted crystal, ran along its back. Its massive tail coiled around broken pillars. Wings, folded awkwardly, protruded from the creature's sides, their edges lined with spines that glistened in the light. The head was enormous, resting upon a bank of ice, jaws slightly parted. Fangs the length of swords were visible, each one coated in a fine layer of frost. For a moment, Jon thought it was dead. A petrified relic from the dawn of days. An impossible fossil. Yet the sound that had guided him there rose once more. He saw the barest movement in the flanks of the beast, a sluggish expansion as it drew in breath. Scales of a pale frosted blue shifted under the flicker of the torch. This was no statue. It lived, somehow, impossibly, it lived. Jon felt sweat freeze upon his brow. He steadied himself, hardly daring to believe he was staring at the legendary ice dragon of northern myth, a creature whispered of in old tales older than the long night. He wondered if it slept in some enchanted slumber, or if it was half dead, sealed away by the magic of the Starks of old. The stories he'd once overheard from old Nan came rushing back to him. Fearsome beasts of winter storms, fabled to breathe shards of freezing mist that could crack the ground with rime. Dragons were creatures of fire and blood, but an ice dragon was said to be a being of the cold void, with a hide that shimmered like diamonds and eyes that blazed with pale light. Yet this dragon's eyes were closed, the lids encrusted with frost. It lay motionless except for the slow, measured rising of its chest. Jon realized he was trembling. He reached out, his hand shaking, to place the torch in a nearby sconce that seemed to have been carved from the natural stone. He prayed it wouldn't set off any reaction from the creature. The flame wavered, sending shadows that danced across the dragon's form. Each scale caught a glint of orange light, twisting it into prisms of blue and white. The gloom around them felt alive, as though thousands of small invisible eyes were watching. Ghost let out a quiet whimper, standing behind Jon with wary tension. Jon knelt, pressed a hand to the stone floor. It was frigid to the touch, but beneath that, there was a faint vibration, the pulse of something ancient. It reminded him of the weirwood trees, how sometimes, if he was quiet enough, he felt them speak in the breeze. But this was different. Older, perhaps. Or perhaps just other. He rose slowly, sheathing Longclaw to free both hands. He advanced a step, 2 steps, toward the dragon's massive snout. The creature's breath rumbled softly, and a faint curl of frigid vapor escaped its nostrils. Jon's mind raced with questions. Why was it here beneath Winterfell? How long had it slumbered? Did the Starks of ages past know? Did some magical pact imprison it here? Or was it guarding something older still? He hovered near the dragon's head, hardly able to process that it was real. He lifted a hand, feeling the swirl of cold radiating from its body. At that moment, the dragon's eyelids fluttered, a faint shifting of membrane and frost. Jon froze. The eye cracked open, revealing an iris of crystalline blue, piercing in its intensity. Jon felt an almost electric shock course through his body. The dragon was looking at him. He dared not move, dared not breathe. Yet the dragon did not erupt in violent motion or unleashing savage ice. Its colossal pupil contracted, then dilated, as if trying to focus. A thin stream of frost-laden air sighed from the half-parted jaws. Jon's breath shuddered as he slowly let it out. His mind reeled, heart hammering so loudly he thought it would echo off the icy pillars. At length, the dragon's eye slid shut again, as though too heavy to keep open. The ancient head settled once more onto the frost-covered floor. Scales rustling faintly, Jon exhaled a trembling sigh, backing away, half expecting the creature to lurch up at any moment. But it did not. He felt an odd sensation, a wave of pity. This enormous being was likely bound in this crypt for centuries, possibly millennia, by magic or by the gradual crush of ice. He had no notion of how or why. He only knew that the North held secrets beyond mortal comprehension, and here was one before him, a living ice dragon, ancient and majestic even in its quiescence. At length, he tore his gaze from the sleeping giant and circled around, studying the cavern from different angles, his torchlight flickering on walls that seemed carved with intricate patterns of swirling shapes. On closer inspection, he saw faint runes or glyphs etched into the ice, half buried by the frost. He recognized none of them, but he suspected they were older than any known script in Westeros. The entire place might be part natural formation, part man-made fortress, part magical prison. The immensity of it weighed upon him, and he realized he was powerless to fathom it tonight. Ghost let out a low whine, pawing at the ground near the dragon's tail. The direwolf scratched at something beneath a layer of ice, something that glinted in the torchlight. Jon approached carefully, kneeling beside his direwolf. He chipped gently at the ice with the hilt of his dagger, revealing a piece of what looked like ancient metal, perhaps part of a ring or a buckle. He found more as he cleared the space. Scraps of rusted iron, so old they were nearly unrecognizable, scattered around as though there had been a battle or a ritual here in ages past. The scattered remains of armor or weapons, now swallowed by the ice, told the story of men who once stood in this place and likely did not leave. Jon fought off a shiver, unsure if it was the cold or the implications of what he was seeing. His mind returned to the dragon. How had it lived all these years? Sealed beneath the earth. Was it sustained by the innate cold of the north? By magic woven into Winterfell's foundation, older than the walls above? For a moment, he considered the possibility that the dragon fed on the castle's heat, that legendary hot springs that warmed Winterfell from below, a unique geology that had been the source of Winterfell's name. He had always been told that the heat came from natural volcanic channels. But now, he wondered if it was some interplay of fire and ice, a balance that allowed this creature to endure. He stayed for an indeterminable amount of time, moving about the cavern, trying to see where the boundary lay. Mostly, it was lost in the gloom, the walls receding beyond the torch's limited circle of illumination. The hush felt sacred, like the crypt of a god. Soon his fingers and toes went numb from the intense cold, and the torch's flame began to gutter. He realized with a reluctant pang that he had to return. He could not hope to solve the mystery alone, and the longer he lingered, the greater the risk. If the creature woke in anger, he would have nowhere to run. If the torch went out, he might never find his way back. Despite the danger, a reluctant fascination tugged at him. Part of him was reluctant to leave, as though the dragon itself was calling out for him to stay. But sense prevailed. He whispered a soft vow to himself that he would return, that he would learn the truth. Then he gathered the dying torch, coaxed Ghost to follow, and retraced his steps up the winding corridor. Each upward step was grueling, for the cold sapped his energy, and the sense of wonder weighed on his thoughts. Finally he came to the blocked doorway, pushed his way through and emerged into the crypt. The air was comparatively warmer, though still chilly. Ghost shook himself vigorously, as though trying to cast off the oppressive memory of that subterranean ice realm. Jon paused to glance back at the sealed passage, heart still pounding. The enormity of what he had found threatened to undo him. He knew he should warn someone, share this discovery, but with whom? Sansa? Arya? Bran? Tormund, perhaps, who had lived beyond the wall and might believe such a story. Sam, if Sam were here, would be the first to search the old texts for knowledge of the creature. But Sam was in the south, or Old Town, or the Citadel. Jon had lost track in the chaos of recent events. He fought the urge to kneel over in exhaustion. The discovery battered at his mind, and he felt a trembling in his bones that no mere cold could account for. Eventually, he made his way back up through the crypts, pausing occasionally to rest a hand against the stone relief of some ancient Stark. In the torch's flicker, their faces seemed stern, solemn, as though silently judging him. By the time he reached the main level of Winterfell, the courtyard was in deeper shadow, and the gray sky had given way to night. Faint moonlight lit the ramparts, but thick clouds promised another snowfall. He emerged into the courtyard, and one of the guards posted near the rampart steps, a young soldier in Stark livery, started upon seeing Jon appear from the darkness. The man gave a quick bow, though his wide eyes betrayed his curiosity. Jon forced a curt nod, unable to muster words. He needed time alone to think. He trudged toward the keep, stepping carefully on the fresh snow, ignoring the soldier's faint greeting. Ghost slunk behind him, tail low, subdued. Inside, warmth from the hearths drifted through the corridors, banishing the worst of the chill from his limbs. He made his way to his chambers, an austere room in one of the towers. Sansa had offered him better quarters, but he had declined. He preferred a simpler space. He pushed open the door, the hinges squeaking. A small fire crackled in the hearth, its flames dancing across the stone floor. He sank onto a wooden stool and let out a ragged sigh, slipping his gloves off and rubbing warmth back into his hands. Images flickered through his mind. The enormous dragon's glittering scales, the subtle rise and fall of its body as it breathed, the piercing eye that had opened for just a moment. He questioned everything. How was it possible? Dragons he knew of were children of fire, beasts that soared from Valyria or hatched across the sea. But an ice dragon was something out of children's nightmares, tall tales that no one truly believed. And yet, there it was, as real as Longclaw at his side. He couldn't possibly keep it a secret for long. But how could he reveal such a thing without proof? Who would believe him if he said there was a live dragon slumbering in the depths of Winterfell? He let his thoughts churn until the small fire had burned down to embers. Outside, the wind picked up, howling across the ramparts and rattling the arrow slits. He lay down on the cot, arms folded behind his head, and stared at the low ceiling. Rest would not come. His mind circled endlessly over the same questions, the same doubts, the same awe. Ghost settled at his feet, letting out a low whine as if sensing Jon's turmoil. At last, exhaustion overcame him, and he fell into a fitful sleep. Morning came quietly, ushered in by a pale light that crept in through the narrow window. Jon rose early, as was his habit. He made his way down to the great hall, where a small company of Winterfell's folk were already stirring, stoking the fires for breakfast, laying out bread and porridge. Steam rose from the kettles in faint clouds. Sansa sat at a long table, conferring with a steward about the provisions needed for the next few weeks. She glanced up and offered Jon a soft smile. He nodded, greeted her politely, and poured himself a mug of steaming tea. He felt her gaze linger on him, sharp and knowing. She had always been observant in her own way, especially now that she led Winterfell. He realized he must appear preoccupied or haunted. Without quite knowing how to begin, he sat beside her, inhaled the warmth of the tea, and kept silent for a long moment while the steward moved away. Sansa's voice was quiet when she spoke. "You look uneasy," she said, studying his face with that calm, level stare she had perfected in difficult time. He hesitated. "I had a walk last night. In the crypts," he said, managing to keep his voice neutral. Sansa arched an eyebrow. "You've been restless. I can see it. Is something troubling you?" Jon almost let it spill out then and there, but a memory of the enormity of that shape in the darkness stayed his tongue. He could hardly wrap his own mind around it, let alone place such a burden on Sansa. Still, she was the Lady of Winterfell now. She had a right to know. Yet words failed him. He took a sip of tea, scalding his lip in the process, and muttered, "There may be old things down there. Passages. Collapsed corners. We should probably check if they're safe." Sansa's eyes narrowed slightly. "We've always known there were old passages. You look as though you found more than a broken corridor." Jon forced a tight smile. "I'll tell you when I know more." He could sense her wanting to press further, but she relented, likely trusting him enough to share when the moment was right. She turned back to her conversation with the steward, speaking about stores of grain and salted meats. Jon excused himself, citing the need to patrol the walls, and stepped out of the hall. The truth roiled in him like an undiscovered tempest. He dreaded the day he would have to bring Sansa or anyone to that chamber beneath the keep. But he knew eventually that day would come. He took to the battlements, letting the cutting wind slap his face awake. Snow fell in small flurries, swirling in eddies around the towers. The guards nodded respectfully as he passed. It was routine to check the watch, ensure everyone was doing their duty. But his mind was only half on the present. In the back of his thoughts, he was planning a return to the cavern. What would he do once he arrived? Attempt to wake the dragon? Examine the runes further? He imagined prying away the ice that clung to the creature's hide, chipping it from around those massive wings. But it felt like an impossible task. The creature was too large, the ice too thick, and the risk too great. He found himself restless all day. When evening approached, he dined with the household, forced himself to engage in small talk with some of the bannermen who had arrived for consultations. But he kept glancing at the door, itching to slip away once more. The day stretched on in a fog of anticipation, as though the hours themselves conspired to slow his every step. Only Ghost seemed to share his mood, pacing near his chair, occasionally letting out a soft whine. By the time night finally crept in, Jon donned a heavier cloak, took a fresh torch, and made his way back down to the crypts. The same gloom settled over him as he descended. He found the sealed doorway exactly as he had left it, though the broken timbers looked more precarious in the wavering torchlight. He squeezed through and followed the sloping corridor once more, each step of descent awakening that same tightness in his chest. The intense cold caught him in a fierce grip when he reached the cavern's threshold, the frosted pillars shimmering at his approach. His eyes strained against the darkness. The dragon remained in the center, partially encased in ice, unmoving except for the faint rise and fall of its ribcage. This time, he prepared himself for that sense of awe. Yet nothing could truly prepare him. It was as if he beheld an elemental force, older than men, older than houses, older than the White Walkers, older than time's count. He circled cautiously, stepping over shards of broken ice, Ghost stayed close, though the direwolf's ears were flattened in unease. He drew near to the dragon's flank, where a great patch of frost sealed the beast to the floor. He set the torch in a stand carved from the stone, then reached out to place a hand on the dragon's scale. The moment his glove touched the surface, a sharp shock of cold shot through his arm. The scale beneath his fingers was like polished glass, slick yet lined with faint ridges. He half expected the dragon to lurch awake, but it only rumbled in that slow, steady breathing. The magnitude of the creature's presence swelled in his mind. He whispered something, unsure if it was a prayer or a plea, a half-formed question that died on his lips. He pressed a little against the scale. Beneath that translucent surface, a pale blue coloration pulsed, almost as if the dragon's heartbeat responded to his touch. He jerked his hand back, gooseflesh prickling over his arms. The air smelled of ice and dust, a combination so old that it felt like inhaling the memories of 1,000 winters past. Jon tested the ice around the dragon's wing. It was solid, thick, seemingly as hard as iron. He gently tapped it with the hilt of his dagger. It rang out with a high note like striking glass. There would be no easy way to remove the dragon from its prison. He wondered if the beast was truly trapped. Could it not shatter the ice if it stirred with its full strength? Or had the centuries drained it? Or was there some deeper magic at play, sealing the beast in a slumber too profound to break? He ran his hand across the rough ground near the dragon's side, brushing away thin shards of ice to reveal more of the etched runes. He could not read them, but he recognized a repeating symbol, a swirl that reminded him of the sigil patterns found among the first men. He thought of Bran, who had a mysterious connection to the old magic. The three-eyed raven's knowledge might shed light on what this place was. If only Bran were here. But his brother was far away, traveling or meditating in the Greenseer's ways, and Jon wasn't even sure how to call him back. He rose, walked around the dragon's head again. This time, he felt bolder, stepping closer until he stood not more than a sword's length from those colossal jaws. Even through the thick ice and the dragon's slow respiration, he sensed a faint warmth emanating from within the creature's belly. It was as if the dragon's core held a cold fire, the opposite of the living flame of other dragons. Jon wondered if it was the dragon's breath that accounted for the intense chill. Legend said an ice dragon's breath could freeze lakes and cause storms of snow and hail. Was it possible that Winterfell's winter-like climate all year long was linked to this ancient being? His mind circled with possibilities, each one more fantastic than the last. He thought of the threat from beyond the wall, the lingering presence of the White Walkers, or any remnants of undead. If the North faced another dire threat, could this dragon be awakened to fight, as Daenerys dragons had fought on fields of fire? Or would it be a danger to them all, unstoppable and fierce, unleashing a winter beyond imagining? The precarious nature of it all unsettled him. Yet, there was a strange calm in the dragon's presence, as though it recognized him, or recognized the stark blood that ran through his veins. Or perhaps it recognized something else entirely, something from his Targaryen heritage that he himself had learned about too late, something that connected him to dragons. A complicated swirl of identity churned in him. Was he more Stark or Targaryen, or both equally? Would the dragon sense his partial lineage as a dragon rider? Or would the stark winter side of his family resonate with its icy nature? The questions were too large. He had only the hush of the cavern for answers, and the distant thunder of the dragon's breathing. He lingered a while longer, gazing up at the sweeping arches of the wings, the spines along its back that sparkled with captured hoarfrost, the massive claws that curved out, each as long as a man's forearm. Then he began to explore the perimeter of the cavern again, searching for any openings, side passages, or runic carvings. The faint light of the torch revealed a few more lines etched into the walls, cryptic patterns and shapes that might be letters, might be sigils. He traced them with gloved fingertips, feeling the uneven grooves. Some power, older than he could comprehend, had shaped this. Far off in the darkness, the curve of the cavern disappeared beyond his line of sight. He felt an instinctive urge not to wander too far. The torchlight only extended so far, and the risk of becoming lost was real. So he returned to the dragon's side. He noticed something new near its forelimb. A place where the ice had cracked slightly. A faint glow emanated from within, pale and ghostly, as if a hidden moonlight lay entombed beneath the dragon's protective scales. He knelt, peering closer. The glow pulsed, barely perceptible, and with each pulse, the air around it grew colder. A swirling memory of old stories stirred in him. Some claimed that ice dragons had hearts of living ice that glowed with the power of the moon, or with the winter's spirit itself. He leaned in, breath catching in his throat. But the crack was too small to see through. He only caught glimpses of a luminous shape beneath. Absently, he laid a hand on his chest, recalling the times he had risked his life for the North, for those he loved, the times he had bled and died, and been brought back by the Red Woman's sorcery. So many unnatural things had touched his path. And now he stood next to a living myth, older than that sorcery. Time drifted. He only knew that he had knelt there for a long while, mesmerized, until his torch began burning dangerously low. He murmured a farewell, feeling somewhat foolish for addressing a sleeping beast, but unable to do otherwise. Then he left the cavern for a second time, heart heavy with wonder. The next few days passed in an agonizing slow blur. Duties demanded his attention. He helped with inspections of the walls and the training of younger recruits. He oversaw issues of supply. He met with Sansa regarding potential bandit raids near the White Knife. He wrote letters to the lords loyal to House Stark, discussing the uneasy political climate that lingered even after the war. Each night, he thought of descending into the crypts again, but forced himself to wait. He had to be careful not to arouse suspicion, to not appear too reclusive or obsessed. Still, the secret ate at him, coiling like a serpent in his thoughts. He noticed that Arya watched him from time to time, a small frown drawing her brows together. She had a way of knowing when people were hiding things. Once or twice, he caught her following him at a distance, as if trying to puzzle out what kept him restless. He hoped she would trust him enough to let it lie. Bran was not in Winterfell, but sometimes Jon swore he felt Bran's presence in the Godswood, as if the weirwood's carved face observed him and knew. A week after his second visit, he could no longer resist the compulsion. When the sky had darkened once more, he stole down into the crypts with fresh torches, thicker gloves, and a mind resolved to stay longer, to learn more. This time, he brought a small pack of supplies: flint, steel, a slim iron chisel, a water flask. As he ventured deeper, he felt a slight dread, a knowledge that he might be meddling with forces he could not hope to control. But the weight of curiosity pressed him on. The same labyrinthine route led him to the cavern's threshold. The stale air seemed to beckon him inward. The dragon was unchanged. Its colossal head rested on the frozen dais, mighty chest rising and falling like a distant tide. Jon settled his torch, then methodically began to clear ice from the runes along the walls, chiseling gently wherever a thick crust had formed. He worked slowly, pausing whenever the sound echoed too loudly. He feared disturbing the dragon's sleep, though something deep inside him whispered that the creature was aware of him regardless. He uncovered segments of runes that curved in a crescent shape around the perimeter. The lines were fluid, reminiscent of the earliest script of the First Men, but laced with designs he'd never seen. The pattern repeated in certain places, swirling outward from a central glyph. When he stepped back, the lines formed something like the silhouette of a dragon. It was as if an ancient artist had etched the shape of an ice dragon flying across a starry sky. Below it, smaller figures knelt in supplication or worship. It reminded Jon of the Valyrian custom of revering dragons, yet this was far older and set in the north. Could the people of the north once have worshipped an ice dragon in times before the Andals, before the Targaryens? A crack of ice snapped behind him, and he spun, half drawing Longclaw. The torch flickered, revealing no immediate threat, only the giant shape of the dragon, still slumbering. A trickle of water dripped from a pillar where a faint warmth must have melted the frost. He exhaled, feeling foolish for his jumpiness. Ghost was near the dragon's flank, sniffing cautiously at a patch of ice. Every so often, the direwolf glanced at Jon, as though expecting instructions. With measured steps, Jon approached the dragon's side again, searching for that crack near the forelimb where he'd seen the glow. He found it. It looked slightly wider than before. A faint glimmer still pulsed from within, like a ghostly heartbeat. Jon rubbed his jaw, considering. Should he attempt to open the fissure further, risk waking the beast or harming it? He chewed on the inside of his lip, then decided to try, but very, very carefully. He took out the iron chisel, placed it gently at the edge of the crack, and tapped it lightly with a small hammer head brought. Each strike echoed loud as thunder in the still chamber. He paused after every tap, heart racing, listening for any reaction from the dragon. A deeper rumble of breath was the only response. Slowly the crack expanded. The glow intensified. A thin line of frigid air rushed out, chilling his face. Suddenly, a shard of ice broke away, revealing a glimpse into a hidden pocket beneath the dragon's scale. Something shone with a soft, internal luminescence. He leaned close, holding his breath. A swirl of color danced within, reminiscent of the aurora that sometimes illuminated the northern sky. It was beautiful, breathtakingly so, and utterly alien. He reached out, fingertips tingling, only to pull back as the dragon stirred. A tremor rippled along the beast's flank, and the soft glow seemed to pulse in time with that movement. Jon scrambled back, expecting the great wings to unfurl in a storm of motion, but the dragon merely shifted, eyelids fluttering. A low growl emanated from deep within its chest, the resonance vibrating the floor. Ghost barked in alarm, hair standing on end. For a moment, Jon stood transfixed, unable to decide whether to run or remain. Then, as if lulled by some internal force, the dragon settled again. Its breathing returned to that steady rhythm, though the air seemed thick with a reawakened presence. Jon swallowed. He crouched near Ghost, placing a reassuring hand on the direwolf's head. Perhaps it was better he not tamper further tonight. The risk of fully rousing this ancient being was too great. But the glimpse he had seen haunted him. The swirling radiance beneath the scale. Half ice, half living essence. He stepped carefully away, retrieving his torch, and cast one more long look at the creature. He was seized by the notion that this was no mere beast, but a power of the Old North, as bound to winter as lore was to fire. He whispered a vow that he would return again, though a creeping fear told him that each visit was weaving a bond he did not fully understand. If the dragon woke, it would know him. If it woke in fury, no mortal men could contain it. He bowed his head slightly, almost in reverence, then turned and left the cavern. The ascent felt longer than ever. The image of that luminous pocket beneath the dragon's scale burned in his thoughts. He tried to imagine the stories such a being could tell if it could speak, the eons of cold nights and hidden secrets that lived in its memory. He emerged into the crypts with stiff limbs and a pounding heart. Back in the castle, he washed the cold from his face in a basin of lukewarm water, but he could not shake the chill that clung to him. Even in his chamber, with the fire built high, a ghostly cold lingered in his bones. Days became weeks. Snow piled in the courtyard, and every day, men had to shovel paths just to move supplies from the stables to the main keep. The nights were long and dark, filled with northern winds that rattled shutters and made the walls creak. Jon's visits to the cavern continued, each time bringing some new discovery, each time witnessing a subtle shift in the dragon's posture or an expansion of the cracks in the ice. He observed that the beast's breathing grew slightly less sluggish, and once or twice, it seemed to follow him with half-opened eyes of crystalline blue. He discovered more about the runes along the cavern walls, though he could not read them. He made rubbings on parchment, hoping someday to show them to someone learned in the old tongues. He found traces of old metalwork, half buried in ice. He even uncovered a tarnished amulet shaped like a snarling direwolf's head. It made him wonder if some ancient Stark ancestor had worn it down here long ago. But how had that confrontation ended? The presence of so much debris suggested conflict, or perhaps a sacrificial rite. Or maybe the men had simply perished from the cold. Each visit weighed heavier on him. He could sense the dragon's awareness blossoming. It was a slow, half-dreaming consciousness, but it drew him in. Sometimes, He almost felt he could hear a voice at the edge of his mind, a low resonance that vibrated in his chest rather than his ears, as though the beast reached out in some primal form of communication. It never formed words, but it carried emotions. Caution, curiosity, ancient sorrow, and an indescribable longing. When Jon was away from the cavern, he found it difficult to concentrate on anything else. He would stare over the battlements at the endless white fields, or at the swirling snow that turned the sky into a haze, and wonder if the dragon's presence might influence the winter itself. Could it be that the severity of the cold was linked to the dragon's slow awakening? He had no proof, only questions that gnawed at him. He spoke little to anyone, though Sansa's worried looks followed him from across the hall. Arya, too, seemed close to demanding answers. Once, she cornered him in the courtyard and asked outright, "What are you hiding, Jon?" He met her gaze and tried to form a reply, but all he could manage was, "Trust me. I'm not ready to speak of it yet." She scowled, fists clenched, but eventually relented, likely out of respect for him. Still, Jon knew the time for secrecy would soon end. If the dragon continued to stir, the day might come when the very walls of Winterfell trembled, and no locked door would hide the truth. He resolved that he needed more information, more time to piece together the runes, to understand whether this was a benevolent guardian, a harbinger of doom, or something in between. In the depths of his heart, he felt a pull that he could not entirely define. A kinship, perhaps, or a sense that his own destiny had led him here, to stand vigil over an ancient power of the north. Late one night, as he hovered near the great hall's fireplace, letting the heat chase away the stubborn chill, he found himself replaying every moment he had spent in that subterranean realm. He remembered the dragon's massive eye opening to meet his gaze, the glimmer of intelligence within, the slow, thunderous breathing that seemed to match the beat of his own heart. He thought of the faint glow beneath the scale, that swirl of ethereal light that beckoned him onward. His eyes were half closed, and he nearly drifted into a waking dream, until a voice near his ear made him jump. Arya stood at his elbow, silent as a shadow, her expression sharp with concern. "Jon, you're shaking," she said, her tone soft but firm. He looked down. His hands trembled slightly. The cold he felt was not merely from the weather. He tried to steady himself. "I'm fine," he said hoarsely, though they both knew it was a lie. She took a breath, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening, and then lowered her voice. "Whatever you're facing, you're not alone. Remember that. You don't have to carry it by yourself." He studied her face, the fierce loyalty in her eyes, and felt a pang of guilt. She was right. He had always fought side by side with his family, his allies, never alone. But how did one share a burden like this? He swallowed, gave a tight nod, and mumbled something about needing time. Arya hesitated, then placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of affection from her. She squeezed lightly, then slipped away without another word. Jon stood there in the flickering firelight, heart heavy with the secrets he harbored. He thought of the dragon's potential, the fearsome might it could unleash if awakened in rage, or if someone with ill intent discovered it. And he thought of Winterfell, how it had stood for thousands of years, sheltering Starks who guarded the north through long winters. The discovery of this ancient ice dragon threatened to upend everything he understood about the realm. Yet deep inside he felt the stirring of something else, a hope that perhaps this bond between man and dragon, between living fire and living ice, could be the key to defending the north against evils that still lurked in the shadows of the world. He closed his eyes and breathed in the warm air of the hall, letting the crackle of the fire lull him, at least for a moment, into a semblance of peace. Tomorrow, he resolved, or perhaps the day after, he would descend once again into that frozen womb beneath Winterfell. He would stand before the slumbering titan, listening to its ancient breath, feeling the quake of its heartbeat, and he would glean whatever truths he could from the silent runes. For good or ill, he sensed that his fate was entwined with the dragon's. Winterfell's foundations held secrets beyond mortal ken, and Jon Snow would walk that perilous path, guided by duty, by curiosity, and by an unbreakable bond with the cold magic that slept in darkness, waiting for the moment to awaken to a changed world. Inaka, Inmai, Nowhanter. The next morning brought a sharper chill, as though the very marrow of the world had frozen solid overnight. Jon Snow could feel it even through the stout walls of Winterfell, an extra bite in the air, a weight that pressed on the castle from above and beneath. The sky was thick with steely clouds, and a fitful wind fluttered the banners along the ramparts. Men huddled in cloaks on the battlements, squinting into the grayness, while stable hands trudged across the courtyard with stiff limbs, pausing to stamp warmth back into numb toes. Snow dusted the paving stones, and the muck of the previous day's traffic had turned to solid ruts. It was the heart of winter once again, pressing down with ruthless insistence. Jon rose from his bed with a lingering tightness in his chest. Though the fire in his small hearth had been fed through the night, the room remained cold. He dressed quickly, struggling with leather straps and buckles that felt brittle in the frosty air, and stepped out into the corridor. Ghost padded silently alongside him, the direwolf's breath misting in the gloom. Even this hallway, usually one of the warmer passages, was frigid enough to make Jon's breath puff white. He wondered if his visits beneath the castle were somehow drawing forth a deeper cold, though he had no proof. He made his way toward the great hall, passing a few servants who nodded respectfully. Familiar scents drifted on the air: fresh baked bread, simmering oats, and the faint aroma of pine logs burning. As he entered, the hall's fires offered a welcome reprieve. Joints of meat roasted on a spit, and a half-dozen people were milling about, discussing preparations for the midday meal. Sansa sat at the high table, a fur-lined cloak around her shoulders, her pale auburn hair pinned up in a neat coil that only partially concealed the worry lines across her forehead. She glanced up when Jon approached, a shadow of concern clouding her eyes. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice echoing in the near-empty hall. "I was about to send for you. Are you well? You look tired." He mustered a faint smile. "I'm fine, just restless sleep." She studied him as though weighing that statement. Arya said much the same. "You know how she can be, subtle as a rock. She's worried you're brooding." A flicker of irritation passed through him, though he could hardly blame Arya for noticing what was obvious. "No need to worry," he replied. "I've had a lot on my mind." Sansa's brow furrowed further, but she let the matter rest. Instead, she gestured for him to sit. A servant brought porridge and a clay mug of tea. Jon felt the warmth slide down his throat, the heat a welcome barrier against the chill that had settled into his bones. Sansa and the steward delved into talk about the winter stores, enumerating barrels of salted fish, casks of ale, bushels of root vegetables. Jon tried to focus, but he found his mind drifting to the cavern. The swirling runes, the faint pulses of light beneath the dragon's scales, and that sense of looming awareness. When he realized he had been staring into space, he forced his attention back. Sansa finished up the steward's questions and dismissed him. She turned to Jon, lowering her voice. "We have enough supplies to see us through the worst of the winter, but if the cold persists beyond what's usual, I'll have to send riders to the surrounding keeps, see if they can spare anything. The larders are well stocked, but not inexhaustible." "Ma'am." Jon took another sip of tea, nodding. "We should do that sooner rather than later. If we wait until we're in true need, the roads might be impassable." She nodded. "Agreed. We'll see who might lend assistance." Her eyes flicked toward Jon. "I also wanted to discuss something else. Over the past few days, a few people have mentioned strange noises coming from the lower levels of the crypts. I've heard it twice now. Servants whispering in well, they called it moaning or sighing. Some say it's just the wind in the tunnels. But rumors grow quickly in winter, especially with so many idle hands and anxious minds." Jon's heart thumped a little faster. He swallowed. "Probably just old stone shifting. Winterfell's foundations go back thousands of years." Sansa watched him closely. "Yes, they do. I'm not sure the staff will be satisfied with that explanation. This is the North after all, and superstitions run deep. They'll make it into a ghost story or something worse." Jon forced a calm expression. "Let them talk. There's little to be done about it." She hesitated, as though unconvinced. A part of her seemed ready to pry deeper, but she relented and let out a small sigh. "Very well. Just keep an ear out if you would. If anything might truly threaten the castle, we should know." He nodded. "I will." She offered a polite, somewhat strained smile, then excused herself to finalize more steward business. Jon watched her go, a pang of guilt tugging at him anew. The strangest part was that he didn't truly know whether the ice dragon posed a threat or not. It might indeed be a dire danger to everyone above if it awakened in fury. Or it might remain the silent guardian it seemed, entombed in ice. He only knew that it existed, and that knowledge weighed on him like a mountain of snow. He finished the rest of his porridge quickly, and retreated into the castle's corridors, Ghost at his side. His mind worked feverishly. Sansa was right that rumors would flourish. People already complained of hearing unusual noises. If the dragon so much as exhaled in a deeper dream, it could echo through the catacombs like a giant's groan. The more restless it became, the harder it would be to hide. He considered telling Sansa. Perhaps with her authority, they could manage to keep the secret safe. Or at least handle it responsibly. But then he pictured the fear that would overtake the castle if word spread that an ice dragon slumbered in the crypts. The northern lords might see it as a weapon or a terror. They might demand it be destroyed, or worse, harnessed. How could one hope to control a being of such ancient power? The idea of men attempting to chain or kill it, and the ruin that might follow, made his stomach twist. Hours passed as he assisted around the armory, consulted with Roderick Castle's successor on the training of younger knights, and made a point of patrolling the walls with the guards, checking for weaknesses. The wind grew fiercer, lashing at him with icy fangs. By mid-afternoon, a leaden gloom covered the sky, promising more snow. The daylight was pale and wan, and shadows stretched long. Winter's presence was everywhere, an unrelenting force. Jon's thoughts drifted to the crypts again. Each time he considered going, duty waylaid him. A request for advice. A small crisis in the stables. A matter of local dispute. But come nightfall, he slipped away as quietly as he could, a fresh torch in hand. He took the familiar path to the crypt's main entrance, ignoring the faint prickle at the back of his neck that reminded him of how the staff had gossiped. Ghost padded ahead, nose low to the ground, occasionally letting out a soft huff. When Jon reached the corridor that branched off toward the sealed passage, his heart quickened. He half expected to find a guard posted, or the door reblocked. But the broken timbers were exactly as he left them. He squeezed through. The darkness welcomed him like a cold embrace. Stale air prickled his nostrils. He made the careful descent, torch held high, feeling the uneven stones beneath his boots. Each step echoed. Each small sound reminded him that he was descending into the lair of something far beyond mortal ken. By the time the corridor opened into the vast subterranean chamber, his stomach was clenched with a mixture of dread and awe. He paused on the threshold, letting the torchlight sweep across the silent columns of ice, the sprawling floor that glittered with frost. The dragon lay in the center, as always. Tonight, it seemed more restless, as though some subtle shift had occurred. The arch of its back was slightly elevated, and its tail, which had been curled close to its body, was now stretched along the edge of a broken pillar. A faint haze of icy fog wreathed its head, drifting in slow coils from its nostrils. Jon forced himself to approach. Each time he neared the dragon, he felt a tug in his chest, as if the very air was charged with a primal energy that spoke to him. Or perhaps it was his own fear. He placed the torch in a wrought iron stand, something he'd hammered into a crack in the floor on a previous visit, then drew closer to the massive flame. The pulse of cold radiated outward, a living frost that made his lungs ache. He took a breath, forcing himself to press onward, and laid a gloved hand against the scales. They were slick beneath his touch. He heard a low rumble, like distant thunder, and realized it came from the dragon's throat. Its eye flickered open by a sliver. Jon froze, staring into the luminous blue gaze. The dragon's pupil contracted in the sudden light, focusing on him with undeniable awareness. For a long moment, neither moved. A wave of dread swept through Jon. He almost pulled his hand away. Yet something in the dragon's gaze stopped him. He sensed no immediate malice there, only a kind of deep curiosity, mixed with the ache of ages. He remembered the first time he'd touched a dragon's side, though that was Daenerys' creature Rhaegal, in a land of far different climate. This was an altogether different presence. Where her dragons radiated heat and flickers of flame, this beast seemed woven from winter's chill and starlight. Carefully, Jon lowered his hand, hoping not to provoke a sudden lunge. The dragon's eyelid lifted further, revealing the full iris, a shimmering hue that reminded him of the aurora. Its massive nostrils flared, exhaling a plume of frosty vapor. Jon shivered as the cold enveloped him. Still, the dragon did not strike or roar. Instead, he felt a vibration in his bones, as if the creature was speaking in a language deeper than words. He found himself whispering, though he wasn't sure why. "Can you understand me?" His breath turned to steam in front of his face. He felt foolish, speaking to a slumbering myth, but in the hush of that cavern, the question felt necessary. The dragon's chest rose, sank, releasing another rolling breath. A gentle quiver passed through the scales beneath Jon's palm. Then, almost imperceptibly, the creature closed its eye again, as if acknowledging him, and returning to a half-doze. Jon let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He stood there for a long minute, heart pounding, feeling the dragon's slow and regal life force reverberate through the ice-laden air. At length, he moved away from the dragon's flank, noticing that more cracks had spread through the ice binding the wings and tail. It was as though the creature's body heat, or cold, as paradoxical as that sounded, had begun to shift the equilibrium of its prison. With each day that Jon visited, the beast seemed more present, more awake, even if it slept. He wondered how long before it fully broke free, whether by slow thawing or by some explosive act of force. He passed a hand over his face, trying to quell the tide of anxious thoughts. Then he took the torch and walked around the perimeter of the cavern, examining the runes and carvings again. He discovered new details each time. The shape of men kneeling, the spiraling lines that might represent swirling snow or storms. Tonight, he noticed a figure carved near the top of one of the ice pillars, almost invisible in the gloom. It showed a stylized direwolf, mouth open in a silent howl, standing beside an enormous serpent-like figure with wings extended. He lingered there, tracing the etching, the direwolf and the dragon together. It felt oddly symbolic, a reflection of his own fractured bloodline, Stark and Targaryen in one. He remembered the day he learned of his parentage, how it shook him to his core, and how he still struggled with the meaning of it. Perhaps it was no coincidence he of all people had discovered this sleeping ice dragon. His thoughts turned to the gods, whether the old gods, the Seven, or the Lord of Light, wondering if some grand design had led him here. The torch began to sputter, so he returned to the dragon's side. He noticed small flakes of frost drifting from the cavern's ceiling, reminiscent of snow falling in slow motion. Carefully, he knelt near the beast's head, one hand resting on the ground for balance. The dragon's eyelids remained lowered, but its nostrils flared with each breath, sending out tiny crystals that sparkled in the feeble torchlight. Ghost, who had been pacing in wide arcs of caution, finally ventured close enough to sniff at one of the dragon's gigantic talons. His posture was tense, but curiosity outweighed fear. Jon exhaled softly, forging a tenuous calm. "You're waking up," he murmured. "I don't know if that's good or bad." He felt a stab of guilt for speaking so plainly, but it was a relief to articulate the fear that gnawed at him day and night. Maybe the dragon couldn't understand his words, but some part of him believed it understood the intent. The air felt charged, as though the beast's presence absorbed every syllable, every breath. He thought of Daenerys dragons, how they had been raised from eggs, growing alongside her. They had known her from birth, forging a bond. This dragon was older than any living memory, sealed in ice for centuries, millennia perhaps, and he had no idea what loyalties or instincts it might possess when fully roused. Yet he couldn't bring himself to see it as purely an enemy. There was something tragically lonely about it, a creature imprisoned in darkness while the world above changed around it. The torch sputtered again, dangerously low, and he knew he'd have to depart. He pressed one gloved hand gently to the dragon's snout. A swirl of frost spread over his fingers, crackling as if the moisture in the air froze at once. For a moment, he felt an odd hum, a resonance that made his heart pound. Then he stood, retrieved the dying torch, and turned to leave. He forced himself not to look back, though the impulse was strong. He knew he'd only linger and risk losing his light entirely, which would be folly in such a place. When he reached the crypts once more, he found he was so cold, he could scarcely bend his fingers. They burned as he rubbed, feeling back into them. Ghost trotted at his side, tail held low. The castle above was dimly lit by torches along the corridors, and most servants had gone to their pallets or small chambers for the night. Jon passed no one on his way back to his room, relieved he did not have to make excuses for his late wandering. Once in his chamber, he built up the fire until the flames roared. Still, the cold in his bones lingered, as if the dragon's touch had etched a layer of ice beneath his skin. He stripped off his gloves and cloak, placing them near the hearth to dry. Then he sat on the edge of his bed, hunched forward, face in his hands. All the misgivings he'd been keeping at bay rushed in like a storm. The rumors among the servants, the possibility that the dragon would soon awaken fully, his responsibility to Winterfell, and the North. He felt pinned between two unstoppable forces, the primal creature below, and the pressing cold that threatened the living. He remained that way for a long while, until exhaustion finally dragged him into a dreamless sleep. When morning came, pale and feeble, he woke to a timid knock at his door. He jerked upright, blinking blearily. The coals in the hearth had burned low, casting faint red light around the chamber. "Come in," he called. The door swung open to reveal Arya, arms crossed over her chest, wearing a half-exasperated, half-worried expression. She gave him a quick once-over. "You missed the morning meal. Are you ill?" He groaned softly, realizing he must have overslept. "I'm fine. I just didn't rest well." Arya stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. Ghost lifted his head from where he lay curled on a pile of blankets, but remained still. She leaned against the stone wall, looking at Jon with narrowed eyes. "Is that the truth?" Jon released a weary sigh, running a hand through his hair. His breath misted in the chilly air despite the embers. "It is, but there's more. I haven't been honest with you. You or Sansa. And it's..." he faltered, struggling for the right words. Arya watched him, unblinking. Then she softened just a fraction. "Go on, Jon." He rubbed his hands together, bracing himself for what he was about to say. The impulse to confess warred with his fear of what might happen once the secret was out. Yet seeing Arya's face, the trust and concern that lived in her features, he felt the burden might be too great to carry alone anymore. He took a breath. "I've been going into the crypts. Beyond the crypts, actually, there's a sealed passage that leads to an immense cavern. Inside it," he paused, searching her eyes, "there's an ice dragon. Alive." For a heartbeat, Arya said nothing. Her posture remained rigid, but her eyes flickered with disbelief. "What are you saying?" She sounded almost calm, as though waiting for him to break into a wry grin and admit it was a jest. But she knew Jon well enough to hear the seriousness in his tone. Jon swallowed. "It's real. I've seen it with my own eyes. Touched it. It's ancient, buried in ice. It's massive, bigger than any dragon I've known. I don't know how long it's been there or why it's here, but it's not just bones. It breathes. I can feel its heartbeat. Doanimipor." Arya stared at him, face pale, lips parted slightly. "Why would you keep this secret?" she asked finally, voice low. "Why not tell Sansa at once? Or gather the men too?" Her words died, and Jon could see the shock in her eyes. She didn't know what the next step should be, and neither did he. He stood, pacing the small chamber. "If people find out, the castle will erupt in panic. They might try to kill it. And if the dragon can fight back, you remember what Daenerys dragons did to armies. If it wakes fully and sees men attacking, the devastation could be immeasurable. And that's if it can even be killed. For all I know, normal weapons won't work on a creature of living ice." "None." Arya's gaze hardened as she processed his words. "And you've gone down there alone all this time?" "John, that's madness. You could have been killed." He shook his head. "It hasn't harmed me so far. I can't explain it, but it's like it knows me. Or at least it tolerates my presence. Maybe it senses the Stark blood in me, or the Targaryen blood. I'm not sure, but I don't feel it's immediately hostile." "No." Arya took a few steps closer, her footsteps echoing lightly on the cold stone floor. "John, this is bigger than either of us. We have to do something." His chest tightened. "I know, but I don't know what. Sansa will need to know. The question is how we manage this, how we keep people from doing something rash that could provoke a catastrophe." Arya bit her lip, glancing away. For a moment her eyes flicked to Ghost, who watched them both intently, ears perked. Then she turned back to Jon. "You have a plan, or at least a direction? Because if you're asking me to keep quiet forever..." "I'm not," Jon said quickly. "I just needed time to learn more, to see if the dragon could be reasoned with, or if it was truly trapped, or if it's a threat. But I can't keep stalling. The servants have heard noises. The cold in Winterfell grows worse. I think the creature is stirring, and soon it might break free of the ice." Arya's mouth tightened into a thin line. "We should tell Sansa, but we need her word that she'll handle this carefully. If we involve the entire household, we risk panic. A few trusted people might help guard the entrance. Make sure no one wanders in or tries to do something foolish." "So," Jon nodded, relief and dread warring in him. "Exactly. We'll tell her soon. Tomorrow morning at the latest. There's no sense delaying. But, Arya, you have to promise you won't tell anyone else until we've spoken to Sansa, together." She studied him in silence for a heartbeat, then inclined her head. "I promise. But if you ever disappear down there and don't come back, don't blame me when I come after you with a small army." A faint, weary smile touched Jon's lips. "I'd expect nothing less." Arya hesitated, then stepped forward and embraced him, a rare gesture between them. He felt the warmth of her body, the comfort of her presence, and allowed himself a moment of quiet relief. Then she pulled away, her expression turning sharp once more. "What do you intend to do tonight?" Jon considered. "I'll keep my usual duties. Patrol the walls, make an appearance in the hall, act as though nothing's changed. We shouldn't raise suspicion before we speak to Sansa. Then, if all goes well, tomorrow morning we'll tell her and figure out our next move." "Mashi?" Arya nodded. "All right. I'll pretend I know nothing for now. But be careful, Jon." She cast him one more intense look and then left, the door clicking shut behind her. Jon stood there for a long moment, exhaling shakily. At least now he wasn't alone in this burden. Arya's reaction had been surprisingly level, considering the enormity of what he'd revealed. Yet a sense of apprehension still gnawed at him. By tomorrow, everything would change. Once Sansa knew, the secrecy that shielded the dragon might begin to crack. It might be for the best, or it might lead to chaos. Either way, the quiet bubble he'd existed in these past weeks was about to burst. He spent the day going about his tasks in a daze, feeling the weight of tension that came with waiting. His eyes lingered on the crypt entrance whenever he passed in that general direction, half expecting to see a flurry of servants or guards investigating. But no one lingered there, at least not openly. He joined the men-at-arms in the courtyard for a brief drill, showing a few young recruits the best way to shield bash, and listened to the clang of steel echo off the walls. The cold air bit at his lungs, but it was a distraction from the swirl of thoughts in his mind. During the midday meal, he made small talk with a knight from the Neck who had arrived with tidings of bandits harassing travelers on the King's Road. Sansa quietly took note, nodding at the possibility of dispatching a small party to restore order. Arya slipped in and out of the hall, offering Jon a subtle look that told him she was counting the hours until they could speak to their sister together. He answered with a minute nod, feigning focus on his meal. By dusk, a thick snowstorm had rolled in, painting the sky a uniform gray-white. The wind howled, rattling shutters and piling drifts against the outer gates. Torches flickered on the walls, and the men on watch duty hunched against the gale. Jon made his patrol, cloak snapping around him, hair crusted with falling snow. Ghost's fur collected a dusting of flakes, making him blend with the swirling drifts. The biting air reminded Jon of the dragon's breath, that deep chill that seemed to reach into the soul. He retired early, feigning tiredness. In truth, he wanted to avoid any further infiltration of the crypts that might raise suspicion. Better to show caution until he and Arya spoke with Sansa to take. He settled in his chamber, stirring the fire and trying to warm himself. His thoughts were restless, drifting to the dragon's crystalline gaze, the slow expansion of cracks in the ice. He pictured the beast fully awakened, rising to its feet, shaking off centuries of frost. The mental image ignited both excitement and terror. What if it soared out of the depths beneath Winterfell, smashing stone in its path? How could anyone contain that fury? At length he drifted into a fitful sleep. Night pressed in, accompanied by the wind's mournful howl. He dreamed of a wide, frozen lake, a black sky pierced by swirling lights, and in the center, an enormous silhouette with wings outstretched, beckoning him closer. He walked forward, breath suspended in the frigid air, but the ice cracked beneath his feet. He felt himself plummet into shocking cold water, darkness swallowing him. The dream jolted him awake, heart hammering. He lay there, chest rising and falling rapidly, the fire's glow the only comfort in the small room. The rest of the night was a cycle of half-sleep and anxious wakefulness. He rose before dawn, the windows opaque with frost. Dressing quickly, he stepped out into the corridor and nearly collided with Arya, who must have been waiting for him. She raised an eyebrow. Couldn't sleep either? He shook his head. Let's find Sansa. In the great hall, servants were just beginning to stoke the fires, setting out bread and warm drinks for the early risers. The hall was mostly empty, save for a few staff shuffling quietly. Jon and Arya discovered Sansa in a small side chamber off the main hall, her head bowed over a ledger as she reviewed expenses by candlelight. She glanced up, surprised to see them both together at this early hour, and set down her quill. Is something the matter? Her gaze drifted between Jon and Arya. Arya closed the door behind them. Jon took a breath. We need to speak with you, privately. Sansa's eyes flickered at his grim tone. She rose, gesturing them closer. The small chamber was cramped, with a table, a few chairs, and a narrow window crusted with ice. Candles provided the only light, painting flickering shadows on the stone walls. Go on, she said quietly. Jon glanced at Arya, then back at Sansa. He could see the curiosity and concern tightening his sister's expression. I've found something beneath Winterfell, in the crypts. Something impossible. An ice dragon. Sansa's eyebrows shot up, and she let out a short, incredulous laugh before checking herself. She saw no trace of humor in Jon's face or Arya's, and her amusement died. You're serious? Arya folded her arms. We've both seen it. Well, Jon has seen it directly. I only learned of it last night. But I believe him. He's been venturing down there for weeks. Sansa looked at Jon, her voice hushed with alarm. Weeks? You've known about this and said nothing. Jon exhaled. I wanted to be sure of what I was dealing with. I still don't entirely understand. But it's real. Immense, alive, sealed in ice in a huge cavern beneath the crypts. I think it's been there for centuries. Neither. Sansa sank back into her chair, pressing her hands to her temples. She looked simultaneously stunned and wary. Gods. An ice dragon. I've heard old stories, but none I believed. Why in the name of all that's sacred is it under our home? That, I don't know, Jon admitted. Perhaps the Starks of old bound it here, or it came seeking the warmth of the hot springs and was trapped. The cavern is full of ancient runes. Ghost and I have found relics of men who apparently died there long ago. No one or... Sansa's eyes darted between them. So it's... asleep? Could it break free? Is Winterfell in danger? Arya answered first, her tone quicker than Jon's. We don't know if it's a threat. But obviously, it's dangerous by its very nature. It's a dragon. Jon took a step closer, speaking softly. So far, it hasn't attacked me. But it's definitely stirring. The ice around it is cracking. and I can sense it's waking more each time I go down there. The staff have begun hearing noises. This can't remain a secret for long. Men. Sansa leaned her elbows on the table, her eyes distant as she tried to absorb the implications. If it becomes known, I can't imagine the panic. People might flee Winterfell, or some ambitious knights might believe they can slay it and become heroes. It could spark chaos. At the same time, we can't just ignore it. Arya's gaze flicked to Jon. We were hoping you'd know how best to approach this. You are the Lady of Winterfell. The decisions rest with you. Sansa released a shaky breath. And we're Starks, sworn to protect the North. That includes protecting people from any menace beneath our own feet. We have to figure out if it can be reasoned with, contained, or if we have to drive it away somehow. But quietly. If rumor spreads beyond these walls, word might reach the Vale, or the Riverlands, or worse, men who would exploit the dragon or see it as a weapon to claim. Belmine. Jon nodded slowly. Exactly. Daenerys dragons changed the balance of power across the continent. The same could happen here if an ice dragon becomes known. We might face a war we're not prepared for. Sansa's hands balled into fists on the table. Very well. We handle this carefully. For now, only the three of us know. We'll need at least a few guards or workers we can trust implicitly to secure the passage. We can't have the kitchen boy wandering down there and stumbling onto it. Arya pursed her lips. We can pick them carefully. Maybe a half-dozen loyal men who want talk. Some we've known a long time. But what then? Jon says the creature is nearly free of the ice. We can keep it locked up if it chooses to break out. A tremor ran through Sansa's hands. We might try to talk to it if it's intelligent. Dragons are said to have cunning, if not language. Or we guide it away, if that's even possible. Somehow coax it to leave Winterfell's foundations without destroying the castle. I don't know how one herds a dragon, especially one made of ice. Jon's throat felt dry. I'll keep going down there, keep it calm as best I can. It seems to accept me. Maybe I can learn its moods, see if it understands any commands. The absurdity of the statement made him grimace. If it's a living being with a sense of self, perhaps it won't want to harm us if we don't provoke it. Sansa stood, pushing the chair back. She began to pace the small room. This is all guesswork, but we have no choice. Knowledge is our best ally right now. Jon, you continue your visits, see what you can discern. We'll gather a few trusted men to guard the crypt's entryway, to ensure no one stumbles upon it accidentally. But we must stress secrecy. Even the guards won't know the full truth? Arya nodded. Just that there's something dangerous down there. A risk of structural collapse or something of that sort. Sansa's eyes hardened with resolve. Yes, exactly. For the moment, that should suffice. Let me do the talking. I'll carefully spin a story about unstable tunnels and the need for vigilance. That much is true in a sense, just not the whole truth. Jon felt an odd relief settle over him. At least now, there was a plan, tenuous though it was. And if it wakes in full force, Sansa's expression turned grave. We pray it doesn't do so in violence. If it does, we'll have to adapt. Winterfell is strong, and we have men capable of fighting. But I pray it never comes to that. A moment of weighted silence enveloped them all, the candlelight flickering over their tense faces. Jon could almost hear each sibling's heart pounding. Then Sansa smoothed her skirts, took a breath and nodded. All right. Let's go to the Great Hall. We have a normal day's business to conduct, and we mustn't let anyone suspect that something is amiss. We'll gather our chosen men discreetly as soon as possible. Jon, you should return to the cavern when you can. See if anything has changed overnight. Napoli doing? Jon inclined his head, gratitude and anxiety warring within him. Thank you, Sansa. I'm sorry for keeping this from you. I didn't know what else to do. She stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a faint smile. You're my brother, our brother. We'll face this together. Arya smiled too, though hers was laced with an edgy anticipation. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious. An ice dragon is beyond anything we ever imagined. Jon huffed softly. That it is. They left the small chamber. each trying to adopt a semblance of normalcy as they emerged into the main hall. Servants bustled about with trays of bread, salted fish, and porridge. The scent of thyme and onions wafted through the air. A few soldiers drowsily sipped ale at a side table. Outside the high windows, snow continued to swirl, cloaking the ramparts in white. Sansa began her daily routine, greeting key members of the household, discussing tasks, and appearing every inch the calm lady of Winterfell. Arya vanished as only she could, presumably to keep a subtle watch on the corridors, or to check on the guards. Jon forced himself to eat a small portion of oatcakes, though his stomach felt knotted. He wondered if the dragon stirred beneath them even now, unsettled by the storm, or by some intangible shift in the currents of magic that bound it. After the meal, he quietly sought out two of the men Sansa had suggested, experienced, loyal, and not prone to gossip. He told them the half-truth. There were unstable tunnels beneath the crypts. No one was to enter except under his direct supervision. They listened with respectful nods, though they cast him curious glances. Jon's demeanor must have conveyed the seriousness of the matter, because neither man asked probing questions. They merely swore to guard the entrance and keep silent. By midday, the roster of guards was set, 6 men, plus Arya and Jon. They would rotate to ensure no prying eyes ventured below. Sansa would sign an edict, stating the lower crypts were off-limits until further notice due to safety concerns. That settled, Jon knew his next task was clear. He needed to see if the dragon remained as he had left it. He descended a few hours later, once the rotation was arranged, and a hush had settled over the castle. He told the men on duty that he was inspecting the unstable tunnels, warning them not to follow under any circumstance. They exchanged uncertain looks, but their loyalty was to House Stark, and they stood aside. Jon stepped through the broken timbers, torch in hand, heart pounding. The familiar descent felt different now. Knowing that Arya and Sansa were aware of his purpose gave him a sense of relief, but the old tension persisted, a chill foreboding that clung to the walls. The torch's flame danced, illuminating the cold stone steps. The deeper he went, the stronger the sting in the air, until he finally entered the vast cavern. At once, he sensed a shift. More ice had fallen from around the dragon's tail, creating jagged piles on the floor. The creature itself was propped slightly higher, its forelimbs braced against a slope of frost. Its head angled upward as though it had stirred recently. The enormous eyelids parted the moment Jon arrived, revealing that intense blue gaze. He stepped forward slowly, aware of how the faint crunch of his boots echoed through the eerie hush. A swirl of vapor drifted from the dragon's nostrils, coalescing into eddies of crystalline motes that sparkled in the torchlight. Jon felt a tremor in the floor, an almost inaudible rumble resonating through the pillars of ice. The dragon was well and truly awake now, at least in some measure. Jon halted a few strides away, raising the torch to cast its light over the enormous head. The dragon let out a breath, a sound akin to a deep, rumbling groan. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing fangs coated in glimmering frost. A swirl of freezing mist curled outward, making Jon's eyes sting. He fought the instinct to recoil. Instead, he held his ground, hands shaking only a little. "It's all right," he whispered, not sure if the beast could even hear him. "I'm not here to harm you." The dragon blinked. Jon watched the shifting membranes over the eyes, each layered with a frosty sheen. He wondered if it recognized his scent or something intangible about his presence. A pang of wonder swept through him. Before him was a living legend, something the world believed impossible. Carefully, he took another step, letting the dragon see him clearly. He raised his free hand, palm outward, a gesture of tentative greeting. The beast's massive pupil tracked the movement. Another low rumble filled the cavern, a vibration that resonated in Jon's ribcage. He felt as though it was speaking to him through the air itself. His breath turned ragged, chest constricting with a mix of fear and awe. He took one more step and lowered his hand to the dragon's snout, lightly pressing against the icy scales. The cold was agonizing, a sharp bite that made him grit his teeth. But he didn't pull away. He remained there, letting the contact stand, as though forging a fragile link. For a brief moment, He swore he sensed the dragon's awareness flowing back at him, a tidal wave of ancient memory and alien perception. He glimpsed, or thought he glimpsed, shards of images in his mind. Colossal glaciers under star-filled skies. The hush of a world blanketed in eternal winter. The long eons of solitude. His eyes filled with tears at the sheer immensity of it. He staggered, and the contact broke. The dragon exhaled in a gust of frigid wind, sending ice crystals swirling around him. Jon gasped, feeling like he had surfaced from deep water. He stumbled back, struggling to regain balance. The creature watched him intently, head tilting in a slow, thoughtful motion. Jon managed to breathe, although each intake burned his lungs with cold. His heart pounded like a drum. He raised his gaze to meet that of the dragon again. "You're not a mindless beast, are you?" he whispered hoarsely. You can feel." The dragon's only reply was a shifting rumble in its chest. Yet Jon felt the weight of a presence that transcended mere animal cunning. Whether it was the beast's primal magic or some intangible bond, there was more here than savage instinct. For a dizzying instant, Jon wondered if the dragon saw him not just as a living being, but as a single thread in a vast tapestry of existence. Then the sensation faded, leaving him drained. He stood there in silence for what felt like a small eternity, the torchlight throwing wavering shadows on the surrounding walls. The dragon's gaze never left him. Around them, ice dripped in steady planks, forming tiny pools on the floor. A hush deeper than any crypt enveloped the moment. Jon realized he was trembling, though he couldn't say if it was from the supernatural cold or from the raw awe coursing through his veins. At last he found his voice. "I don't know what you want," he said softly, though he wasn't sure who was meant to answer. "But if you can understand me, we have no wish to fight you. We only wish to keep our people safe. If there is a way to live in peace." He trailed off, uncertain. The dragon closed its eyes again, but only halfway, as if drifting into a light doze rather than the profound slumber of before. The tip of its tail twitched, scraping more ice from the floor. The air felt thick with a tension that was neither hostile nor benign, but something in between. A precarious equilibrium. Jon realized he could do no more for now. He glanced at the runes on the walls, those swirling carvings of direwolves and dragons, as though they might offer some clue, but they remained inscrutable, silent. He backed away slowly, allowing himself to breathe. When he reached the edges of the cavern, he hesitated, sending the dragon one final, searching look. The partially open eyes followed his departure. Then he turned and climbed the long path back up, the torch's flame casting flickering light that shrank behind him like a dying star. When he emerged into the crypts, he found Arya waiting near the entrance, arms crossed, a single torch of her own lighting the gloom. She gave him a questioning look, and he exhaled, wiping his brow. "It's awake," he muttered. More than before. Arya tensed. "Did it attack?" "No." He shook his head. "But it's aware of me. I touched it, and He struggled for words. "It was like gazing into another world, Arya." "I can't explain." She laid a hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out. Come on, Sansa will want to know." Jon nodded, letting her guide him away from the crypts. His breath still felt labored, as though the cold inside that cavern lingered in his lungs. He wondered if he would ever be warm again. Yet beneath that physical chill lay a spark of something else. The sense that they were on the cusp of understanding. An alliance or a calamity waited in that frozen lair. Which it would be, Jon did not know. But he suspected, more strongly than ever, that his own fate, and the fate of all Winterfell, had become inextricably tied to that ancient dragon of ice, stirring in the dark with secrets older than the memory of men. Okay. Jon Snow emerged from the crypts, with a chill embedded in his very bones, as though the dragon's cold had seeped beneath his flesh. Arya stayed close, matching his stride without a word, though he could sense the question swirling behind her steady gaze. She guided him up to the ground floor of Winterfell, toward a secluded corner of the great hall where Sansa waited. Outside the tall windows, the storm had tightened its grip, the wind howling over the battlements and sweeping snow in swirling eddies across the courtyard. The sky was a near black gray, so heavy it felt as though dusk had come early. Sansa stood near one of the hearths, conferring in low tones with a steward about mundane housekeeping matters. Meals, wood supplies, the management of casks in the cellar. Even from a distance, Jon could see the lines of tension in her shoulders, the rigid set of her jaw. The steward made some note on a thin scrap of parchment, and then withdrew, bowing. Sansa caught sight of Jon and Arya, lifting her head in silent inquiry. Jon nodded, and she dismissed the few hovering servants with a small wave. In moments, the three of them were alone, a hush settling around the hearth's warm glow. Jon drew a breath, still trying to steady his racing heart after the encounter below. He felt the question in Sansa's eyes before she even spoke. "Well?" she asked softly, her voice carrying an urgency she tried to contain. "You look pale, Jon, paler than usual." Arya glanced at him. "The dragon is awake, more than ever. It hasn't attacked, but Jon said it was looking right at him." Jon nodded, the memory still raw. "It is. It recognized me, I think. Or at least it was fully conscious of my presence. It's already broken more of the ice encasing it. The tail was almost free and its forelimbs are braced against the floor like it's testing its strength." He paused, gathering the right words. "I touched it again. This time, it felt like it was showing me something. Memories, or fragments of its being. Not pictures precisely, but impressions. Immense cold, starry skies, glaciers. It's ancient, Sansa ... older than I know how to fathom." Sansa's expression wavered, a combination of apprehension and awe. She folded her arms, stepping away from the hearth. "Do you think it's going to break loose soon? The rumors. They're already breeding. The men I assigned to guard the crypt entrance have begun hearing scraping noises and low groans. We can't keep telling them it's just unstable rock forever. If the dragon emerges suddenly, the entire castle will be thrown into panic." Arya stood at Jon's side, fists at her hips. "We might not have a choice. This thing, it's not going to stay down there forever. If it's half as mighty as Daenerys dragons were, it'll tear through stone if it chooses. What do we do when that day comes?" Jon's gaze flickered to Sansa, then down to his own hands. "I told the dragon, or tried to convey, that we don't mean harm. I don't know if it truly understands, but it didn't lash out. If it can sense my intentions, maybe that counts for something." Sansa's brow creased. "We can't base our strategy on hope alone, Jon. If it decides to free itself, we need a plan. Somewhere we can lead it, or a way to reason with it, if that's even possible. Or at least a place to confine it until it calms." He couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. "Confine it? This is no common beast. Even Rhaegal and Drogon were nearly unstoppable in open battle, and they were raised from hatchlings. This dragon has existed for countless centuries, possibly in tune with magic we barely understand. All I know is that it seems curious about me. That might be our only advantage." He hesitated, voice dropping. I'm not even sure we have the means to kill it if it comes to that." Sansa's eyes snapped toward him, flickering with distress. "I'd rather not contemplate that unless we must. The devastation alone, even if we succeeded, Winterfell could be destroyed in the struggle." Arya's lips thinned. "We need knowledge. Ancient knowledge, the kind we don't have readily here. The crypt's runes, those carvings, maybe they hold answers. We can't read them, but there must be someone who can, or at least someone who knows stories older than the Citadel's books." Sansa stepped away from the hearth, pressing a hand against her forehead as though fending off a headache. Samwell Tarly would have been ideal. He studied so many obscure texts. But he's in the south, last we heard. The road between here and the Southlands is impassable in this storm, at least for swift communication. Arya tapped a foot on the stone floor. "What about Bran? He could see things. If he were here." A silence fell, heavy with regret. Bran's absence was an open wound. He traveled with a vague purpose of learning more about the nature of the land and the living, guided by visions only he understood. Jon had no clear idea where he might be. Somewhere far north, or perhaps venturing toward the Isle of Faces, or engaged in deeper mysteries that defied explanation. Jon looked up. If we could reach Bran somehow. He's the three-eyed raven. If anyone could decipher these runes or glean their meaning from the past, is him. But we have no way to summon him at will. Sansa's jaw tightened. Then we focus on what we can control. We maintain secrecy as long as possible. Arya will keep an eye on the guards, ensure their loyalty. Jon, you continue visiting the dragon. Try to keep it calm, and if it shows signs of trying to escape, warn us immediately. We'll attempt to evacuate the castle if the situation becomes dire. No. Arya nodded, though her expression remained tense. If it tears free while we're unprepared, we might not have the time to save anyone. Jon took a slow breath. I'll do what I can. It doesn't seem ready to surge upward this very moment. It's still uncertain. Gaining its bearings, maybe. But you're right. We can't predict how quickly it'll move. It might remain docile for days or weeks, or it might break free tomorrow. One. Sansa closed her eyes for a moment, then nodded. So be it. We'll stand ready. Keep me informed of every change. Let's proceed quietly now. There's no point in stirring up more alarm. Jon and Arya agreed, and the small group parted. Arya slipped away like a wraith, presumably to scout the corridors and ensure no curious souls ventured too far below. Sansa, composed but inwardly rattled, returned to the official business of the day, meeting with minor lords from the surrounding lands who had braved the weather. Jon made himself scarce, retreating to a lesser-used corridor where the wind howled through the arrow slits, swirling flakes of snow that drifted inside and melted at his feet. He leaned against the cold stone, arms folded, eyes closed. He tried to recall the intense moment of contact with the dragon's consciousness, those fleeting impressions of endless ice fields beneath Auroras, the hush of worlds lost to time. Part of him felt an inexplicable pull, as though the dragon's mind had brushed his own, forging a link he couldn't sever. In that instant, he'd sensed not malevolence, but a profound loneliness mixed with immense power. Could he harness that shared understanding to prevent bloodshed? He wished he had the answers. He remained there until his fingers and nose grew numb, letting the cold keep him alert. Only when he heard distant footsteps did he move on. He wandered Winterfell's halls, stepping over threshold after threshold, passing a handful of guards who saluted or offered polite nods. Occasionally he felt eyes follow him, men likely noticing the tension in his face. He forced a mask of calm, or tried to. Word of unstable tunnels and strange noises had already circulated, and behind every half-closed door whispers likely thrived. By early evening, a dull exhaustion weighed on him. He ate sparingly in the great hall, avoiding conversation, ignoring the curious glances of a few bannermen. The storm raged outside, wind buffeting the towers with unrelenting force. A sense of foreboding sharpened Jon's senses, and he found himself checking on the crypt guards twice, ensuring they hadn't left their posts. They saluted him gravely. None asked questions, which was a mercy. The rest of the night passed in anxious quiet. When dawn broke, if one could call it dawn, the sky showed only a paler shade of gray. Snow fell steadily, piling high against walls and stairways. It was the kind of day that reminded everyone how precarious life in the north could be. Jon rose, dressed in layered furs, and forced himself to eat a hearty breakfast. He needed strength for another visit beneath the keep. Outside the meager comfort of the hearth, the corridors felt practically arctic. Winter's heart had truly descended on Winterfell. Arya caught up with him near the courtyard steps, where a stable hand was shoveling snow away from a storage shed. She spoke in a hushed tone. "Sansa's out speaking with some petty lord about provisions. She wants you to check on the dragon again. See if there's any sudden change. I can come with you." Jon paused. "Are you sure? It's not a sight for the faint of heart." He regretted the words as soon as he said them. Arya's glare was immediate. "You know me better than that," she said flatly. Besides, if this dragon might threaten us, I need to see it myself. I don't like basing our entire plan on your single perspective. No offense, Jon, but one set of eyes isn't enough. He exhaled. None taken. If you're ready for what you'll see, let's go. But be prepared for the cold down there. It's unlike anything you've felt. She adjusted her cloak, pulling the hood tighter around her neck. I'll manage. They made their way to the crypt entrance. The two guards on duty tried to conceal their surprise at seeing Arya. She was, after all, well known for her spirited escapades and stealthy wanderings, but seldom had she ventured so directly into the crypts for inspections. They stepped aside without a word, casting uneasy glances into the darkness beyond. Jon led Arya down the winding stair, their torches hissing against the cold drafts that curled up from the lower depths. The crypts themselves were as silent as ever, the carved effigies of old Starks appearing ghostly in the flickering light. Arya walked beside Jon, her keen eyes flicking from one corridor to another. When they reached the sealed passage with broken timbers, she paused to run her gloved hand over the splintered wood. So here it is, she murmured. The door to the unknown. Jon nodded. Watch your step. It's a steep descent. They squeezed through the gap and began the long downward slope into the hidden cavern. The deeper they went, the more Arya slowed, as if she sensed the shift in atmosphere. The air thickened with cold, pressing into their lungs, stinging their faces. An ethereal hush engulfed them, broken only by the faint crackle of burning torch flames and the drip of melting ice. Jon could almost feel the dread building in her, though she kept her expression unreadable. At last, they emerged into the vast chamber. Arya's eyes went wide. She took in the colossal pillars of ice, the swirling runic carvings, the piles of shattered frost. Then her gaze fell on the dragon. It lay coiled near the center, head lifted, as if expecting their arrival. Its scales glimmered with pale, ghostly luminescence, and the ridges along its spine bristled like frozen spines of a dire beast. Arya sucked in a breath. Jon heard the faint hitch in her throat, but she did not recoil. It's gods, she whispered. I believed you, but seeing it in the flesh, it's even bigger than I imagined. Jon's torchlight danced across the dragon's flank, casting flickering shadows. It's stirring more each day. He nodded toward the cracks in the ice around its hindquarters. That was solid a week ago. Now it's nearly broken free. The dragon regarded them quietly, the blue crystals of its eyes reflecting the torchlight. Its head tilted slightly, massive jaws parting to release a plume of frigid breath that rippled across the floor. Arya tensed, but stood her ground. Jon felt the creature's presence once more, that silent hum of vast awareness. He stepped forward a few paces, raising a hand slowly. Easy, he murmured, not entirely sure if the dragon recognized the calming tone or not. Arya is my kin. We mean no harm. Debrist. Arya moved beside him, adjusting her stance like she was bracing for a potential lunge. She looked from the dragon to Jon, eyes filled with something akin to wonder. You speak to it like it's a person, she said quietly. Are you sure it understands? Jon blew out a breath. Not as we do, but it senses intent. When I touched it, I felt something. It's not just an animal. The dragon shifted, scraping its claws along the ice. A low rumble shuddered through its throat. Arya's torch sputtered in the sudden draft of cold. She and Jon watched, hearts pounding, as the dragon stretched its neck, testing the limits of its partial entrapment. The thick crust of frost around its flank splintered further, cracks radiating outward like spider webs. Chips of ice clattered to the floor. For a moment, it seemed as though the beast might tear itself free right then and there. But it only moved a short distance, then settled again. A swirl of frozen fog drifted from its nostrils. Arya let out a breath she'd been holding. It's only a matter of time, she murmured. You can feel it. Jon nodded, swallowing hard. Yes. Each day, a little more of its prison melts or breaks. When it's ready, it will stand, and perhaps spread those wings. He cast a glance at the cavern's ceiling, wondering if it was wide enough for the dragon to maneuver, or if it would try to force its way upward through the crypts. He approached the beast, step by cautious step, until he stood just within arm's reach of its muzzle. The dragon didn't flinch, though its eyes swiveled to track him. Jon raised his free hand, palm outward. The chill radiating from the creature made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He could almost see tiny crystals forming in the air around its head, shimmering in the torchlight. A moment of stasis passed, tension thrumming like a stretched wire. Then slowly, Jon pressed his palm to the dragon's snout. Pain flared, cold biting through his glove, as though it were made of nothing more than cobwebs. His teeth clenched, but he didn't break contact. He heard Arya's soft intake of breath behind him. The dragon let out a low rumble, its pupil contracting. A swirl of frost laced across Jon's hand and wrist, making him gasp. Still, he held on, trying to project calm. Then, that same resonance as before coursed through him. A wave of sensation, intangible, yet overwhelming. Images or fragments of them flickered in his mind's eye. An endless polar horizon, swirling lights in the heavens, and a bone-deep hush that spoke of a world untouched by mortals. Jon reeled, nearly losing his balance. He caught himself, blinking rapidly to clear the vision. Arya's voice reached him, taut with worry. "Jon?" He slowly withdrew his hand, chest heaving. Fine crystals of ice coated his glove, and he tried to flex his fingers to ensure they still worked. "It's doing it again," he murmured hoarsely. "Showing me glimpses, or I'm picking up on something from it. I can't tell if it's a warning or a memory." Arya stepped closer, though she kept a healthy distance from the dragon's mouth. Her eyes narrowed, taking in Jon's trembling. "You look like you've been dragged half-frozen through a snowdrift." Jon forced a pained smile. "That might be accurate." The dragon's gaze shifted to Arya, as if noticing her for the first time at this close range. She stiffened, but refused to move. The creature let out a hushed growl, a deep vibration. A swirl of icy mist spiraled around Arya's boots. Jon tensed, ready to interpose himself, but Arya stood resolute, refusing to show fear. After a moment, the dragon seemed to accept her presence, turning its head away slightly as though bored. Arya exhaled. "It's unbelievably powerful. We can't let this thing rampage through Winterfell. If there's any way to direct it out safely, we need to figure it out soon." Jon rubbed the frost from his glove. "Agreed. But how do we do that? We can't exactly lead it out on a rope. And even if we manage to bring it to the surface, there's the entire north beyond these walls. Where would it go? Would it just roam free, terrorizing the countryside?" "Maester," Arya scowled. "Perhaps it wouldn't. Daenerys dragons needed to hunt. This one, does it feed on animals, or does it draw strength from the cold itself? We don't know enough." He shook his head, at a loss. "I suspect it's sustained by some form of magic or synergy with winter. The stories of ice dragons say they breathe cold and feed on the lifeblood of storms. But those are just tales. We have no records. Everything we know is guesswork." "Man." Arya took one more lingering look at the dragon, then turned her torch to the runic carvings along the walls. "We should at least see if we can glean anything from these. Maybe there's a pattern or an image that shows how the old Starks dealt with this. If we assume it's been here a long time, someone must have taken steps to keep it sealed." Jon nodded. Together, they moved along the walls, scanning the swirling shapes that told fragments of an ancient story. Arya focused on the outlines of small figures that seemed to bow before a towering dragon form. Another section depicted shapes that might have been weirwood trees, branches curling like stylized arcs, overshadowed by a monstrous beast with wings outspread. Jon recognized the repeated motif of a direwolf standing beside a dragon, both crowned by strange symbols he couldn't decipher. They spent nearly an hour examining every inch of the chamber's perimeter, comparing details, trying to form a coherent narrative. The hush was broken occasionally by the dragon's heavy breaths or the crackle of ice overhead. When Jon's torch began to sputter, they realized they'd found no conclusive explanation. Only cryptic glyphs, swirling lines that suggested worship or dread, and a few scattered images of men kneeling to present offerings to the dragon. Arya kicked at a shard of ice in frustration. We're missing something. Maybe there's another chamber, or more carvings deeper. This place is massive. I can see the darkness beyond the torchlight. The ceiling might arch even farther back. Jon studied the gloom. Indeed, the torchlight only reached a fraction of the cavern. What lay beyond remained in heavy shadow. He could hear drips echoing in the distance, the faint sound of shifting ice that hinted at a deeper hollow. He felt a tug of curiosity, but caution soon replaced it. We shouldn't wander aimlessly. We could become lost or fall into some chasm. Let's plan a more thorough expedition with better light and supplies. Arya nodded reluctantly. Agreed. But time is short. Jon glanced at the dragon once more, still lying in partial repose. It watched them with half-lidded eyes, a regal, almost indifferent posture. Let's go, he said finally, voice tight. We've seen enough for now. They retreated to the exit, stepping carefully over the frost-laden ground. Once they reached the main crypt tunnel, they inhaled in relief. The stale air of the crypts felt almost balmy compared to the biting chill of that subterranean chamber. Arya grimaced, flexing her fingers to restore warmth. Gods, that's cold, she muttered. You weren't joking. Jon sighed. Now you understand what I meant. It's not normal cold. It's like it's alive. They ascended the spiral stair without encountering anyone. The men posted at the crypt entrance saluted wordlessly, apparently noticing the pale strain on Arya's face. Neither Jon nor Arya offered explanation, only a brief nod as they slipped away. Once they were in a quiet corridor, Arya let out a breath. We have to tell Sansa. She'll want details. We should also tell her that we'll need a larger scouting party if we're going to explore deeper. But that means more people in the know, which increases the risk of rumors. Jon rubbed his temples, fatigue washing over him. I know. It's a fine line. But Sansa was right. The best route is knowledge. If there's some hidden sigil or clue about binding the dragon or letting it go peacefully, we might find it deeper in the cavern. Nah. They exchanged a weary look, then made their way to Sansa's solar, where she'd likely gone after her duties. The corridors were drafty, a constant swirl of air sneaking through the smallest cracks. Though the storm outside had relented slightly, snow continued to trickle down in a steady white sheet. Servants bustled around with armfuls of firewood, their faces drawn and tired. The gloom of the season weighed on everyone. In the solar, they found Sansa seated at a wide oak table, poring over parchments by the light of 2 tall candles. A small fire crackled in the hearth, though it did little to warm the spacious room. She looked up immediately as Jon and Arya entered, her gaze flicking from one to the other. One glance at Arya's ashen complexion told her enough. She stood, crossing to them with quiet urgency. Well, she asked, voice low and tense. Arya set down her torch and pulled off her gloves. It's exactly as Jon said and more. The dragon's definitely awake, shifting and cracking the ice. If it wanted to, I think it could free itself soon. Jon managed to touch it again. He nearly froze his hand off in the process. Never? Jon grimaced. It's powerful. There's no mistaking that. We found no sign of an immediate breakout, but it's only a matter of time. The runes on the walls remain unclear. We suspect there's more of the cavern to explore, but we need a bigger group with proper lanterns. A dangerous endeavor. We're certain we can do it alone. Sansa paced, pressing her lips together in thought. This is more urgent than I feared. If the dragon emerges, even if it doesn't intend to harm us, it could inadvertently bring ruin just by thrashing about or unleashing that icy breath. We need a plan to guide it away, or else to ensure it understands we're not enemies. There. Jon spoke hesitantly. You've seen how King's Landing was nearly razed by dragons in the wars. I don't want Winterfell to suffer a similar fate. If there's any way to coax it out gently, we need to find that method. We also have to consider the next step. Once it's free, does it stay in the north? Will it roam to other lands? Could we warn them? It might cause terror wherever it goes. Their sister Dwell. Arya shook her head. The immediate concern is still Winterfell. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Sansa nodded, eyes alight with determination. Agreed. First we explore further, but we must choose carefully who we bring. The fewer who know, the better. It has to be those we trust with our lives. Arya crossed her arms. Bringing even 3 or 4 people might be enough. We need better sources of light, lanterns with strong oil perhaps, and rope to mark our path so we don't get lost in that darkness. Sansa tapped her fingers on the table. We should also bring the maester perhaps. He might not know the runes, but he could record them or note their structure. He's sworn to secrecy, bound by loyalty to House Stark. If there's any small chance he can glean insight, it might help. Jon blew out a breath. He's a good man. Still, that's one more person. But you're right, we're operating blind. We could use all the knowledge we can get. Sansa resumed pacing. Time is short. Let's not delay. Tomorrow morning at first light, gather a small party. Arya, Jon, myself, the maester, and perhaps 1 or 2 guards who can handle themselves and keep quiet. We'll attempt to map the cavern. In the meantime, we should keep watch in case the dragon tries to ascend unexpectedly. Man. Jon spread his hands. That's the best course we have. But I warn you both, if it sees a group of us, it might interpret that as a threat. Sansa's brow furrowed. We must risk it. You said it's curious about you. Stand at the forefront. Show it you're not hostile. Let me and Arya stay back at first. Arya nodded. Understood. And if it does become aggressive, we withdraw immediately. Jon felt the tension coiling in his gut, but he agreed. Yes? Better to flee than to provoke a battle we can't win. Sansa exhaled, the flickering candlelight emphasizing the resolve etched on her features. Then, it's settled. We'll prepare quietly tonight. Gather supplies under the guise of an inspection of the lower storerooms. By tomorrow we'll see how far the cavern extends, and if we can uncover any secret that might help us handle an ice dragon in our midst. Meh. They spent the rest of the evening in furtive planning. Sansa penned a short missive for the maester, summoning him to a discreet meeting. Arya identified 2 guards, who were fiercely loyal and unlikely to spread rumors. Men who had served the Starks for years and owed them personal debts. Jon made a mental list of the gear they would need. Rope, lanterns, extra oil, warm cloaks, a few rations in case the expedition took longer than expected. They kept to the shadows, speaking in hushed tones that the household staff barely noticed. Jon's mind churned with the enormity of their undertaking. He pictured leading a small party into that frozen realm, confronting a beast the size of a galleon. The memory of that psychic brush, the dragon's cold mind invading his senses, sent shivers through him. Yet if they wanted to stave off disaster, they had no choice. That night, sleep proved elusive. He lay in his chamber, firelight dancing across the walls, the wind rattling the shutters. Ghost curled at the foot of the bed, ears twitching each time the wind moaned. Jon stared at the ceiling, thoughts drifting between dread and a strange awe that still lingered from his connection to the dragon. Something about its presence tugged at him, like a half-remembered call. He wondered if the Targaryen blood within him resonated with the creature, or if that was wishful fancy. Whatever the reason, he felt he stood at the threshold of a bond he had neither asked for nor understood. Eventually he dozed, only to be tormented by wild dreams of icy skies and swirling storms. He saw Winterfell's towers blanketed in drifts so deep that only their tips showed above the snow. Then he flew above them, wreathed in starlight, seeing the entire north stretched out as a barren, moonlit tundra. In the dream, the dragon's roar shook the heavens and the land cracked under a new glacial epoch. He woke in a lather of sweat, heart pounding, the final echoes of the roar still ringing in his ears. Ghost whined softly, sensing his distress. He rose before dawn, shaking off the remnants of the nightmare. The corridor outside his chamber was eerily quiet, darkness lingering in the corners as the meager glow of torches flickered on damp stones. He rubbed his eyes and prepared for the day. The cold pressed in, even this high above the crypts, and a swirl of unrest churned in his stomach. At daybreak, though the sky was still an oppressive slate, he met Arya in the courtyard. She'd bundled up in dark layers, her face half hidden by furs. Snow still drifted lazily, and the wind nipped at their exposed skin. Not far off, Sansa spoke with the maester, who looked both puzzled and concerned, glancing between the gear they gathered and the tall figures of the two loyal guards. Sansa must have given him only sparse details, that they were investigating structural anomalies beneath the crypts, and his expertise might be needed. Jon joined them, offering a curt greeting. The maester inclined his head. "Lord Stark? Well, forgive me. I still call you that sometimes." "Jon." "Lady Stark mentioned I might be of some assistance, though the matter is quite vague." "Nanner?" Jon exchanged a look with Sansa. "You're here because you can keep confidence. What you're about to see, it can't leave this small circle. Is that understood?" The maester blinked, clearly unsettled. "Of course. My oath is to house Stark and Winterfell." "I swear my discretion." Sansa stepped in, voice calm. "We'll reveal more once we're below. For now, just know that we're dealing with a very old part of Winterfell's foundations. Possibly older than anything we know. Please, gather your notes as you see fit, but do so quietly." "Burn." The maester gave a hesitant nod, shifting his leather satchel. "Yes, my lady." They set out, 6 in total. Jon, Sansa, Arya, the maester, and the 2 guards bearing lanterns and ropes. They drew little attention at this early hour. A few servants eyed them curiously, but no questions were asked, perhaps assuming they were going to inspect the crypts for minor repairs. Jon led the way, silent as they descended. He felt a cold sweat break out at his temples, memories of the dragon's gaze vivid in his mind. When they reached the main crypt, the new pair of guards posted outside stiffened in salute, stepping aside as the small group slipped into the shadows. The old tombs rose around them in silent witness. Stone Starks perched with their deery wolves at their feet. The flicker of lantern light gave the statues a lifelike quality that made Sansa frown uneasily. Even the maester looked around with wide eyes, as though sensing some hidden presence. Soon, they reached the sealed passage. The guards and the maester stared at the half-broken timbers in confusion, but said nothing. Jon stooped to lead them through, and down they went, the same cold dread intensifying with each step. The air grew sharper, and the lantern flames danced in agitated flickers, as if protesting this journey into a haunted domain. The maester whispered a small exclamation when they arrived at the vast cavern. Ice glistened everywhere, forming pillars as tall as any castle tower, riddled with cracks that captured the lantern light. The swirling runes near the entrance froze him in place. He fumbled for parchment, but Sansa laid a hand on his arm and shook her head, cautioning silence. For once he complied, though his eyes shone with curiosity. Jon took the lead, creeping forward. The 2 guards stepped carefully behind, scanning the gloom, their hands never straying far from the swords at their hips. Arya and Sansa stayed close to the maester, flanking him in case he panicked or stumbled. The hush was broken only by the drip of water and the crunch of boots over frosty ground. The cold burned their lungs, forcing shallow breaths. They found the dragon near the center, upright on its forelegs, the tail partly uncoiled, ragged chunks of ice scattered around. It was fully aware of their presence. Jon could sense the intensity of its gaze before he even lifted his eyes. When he finally looked, he saw the luminous orbs fix upon the group, a slow, reptilian blink, giving the only indication that it recognized multiple figures this time. One of the guards swore under his breath. The Uther's face went as white as the snow. The maester staggered, nearly dropping his lantern. Only Sansa and Arya, somewhat prepared, managed to maintain composure, though both wore expressions of breathless shock. Jon carefully raised a hand, signaling them to hold steady. He approached the dragon, each step deliberate, heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. The creature's head swiveled, following his movement. Ice crystals formed in the air around its nostrils, drifting like tiny diamonds. Its massive claws scratched faintly against the floor, leaving grooves in the frost. Jon reached a point just a few paces away, close enough that the dragon's breath stung his cheeks. He forced himself to speak, voice trembling but clear. "We're not here to harm you." The words echoed oddly off the frozen pillars. He had no idea if the dragon could understand, but he hoped it caught the tone. "We only wish to learn." Sansa and Arya held back. The maester stared at the beast with wide eyes, the pages of his parchment trembling in his hands. One of the guards swallowed audibly, while the other seemed frozen in place. The dragon let out a low, rumbling growl, vibrating the cavern floor. A swirl of mist rolled from its jaws, drifting toward the group. They stood tense but unmoving as the cold enveloped them, making the lantern flames flicker wildly. Slowly, Jon reached out. The dragon's head lowered a fraction, letting him place a gloved palm upon its snout once more. He braced for the flash of alien sensation. It came swiftly, a dizzying swirl of ephemeral images, a crackling whiteness that might have been ice under starlight, and a faint impression of something else, something akin to sorrow. Jon's breath caught, and he struggled to maintain his footing. He glimpsed his own reflection in the dragon's eye, realizing how small and mortal he looked in contrast. Yet something in that reflection seemed to say, "I see you." He broke contact, stepping back as the cold threatened to overwhelm him. His hand shook so violently that he had to clench it into a fist. The dragon's attention flicked to the others, each of them standing like statues. Sansa's face was a mask of subdued terror, but she remained resolute. Arya wore an expression of fierce determination, though beneath it, Jon saw the flicker of genuine fear. The maester, meanwhile, appeared on the verge of panic, though his scholarly instinct kept him rooted, eyes darting over every detail of the dragon's hide. The guards looked ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Jon took a shaky breath. "This is what I've been dealing with," he said quietly, voice echoing in the hush. "It's more than a beast. You can feel it, can't you?" Sansa swallowed. I do. It's like the very air is alive." She forced her gaze to the dragon's eye, and it returned her stare with cold, dignified regard. "If it breaks free, we'll never contain it." Arya spoke up, low and tight. "Then we must find answers deeper in this cavern. One look at these runes might not be enough. We need more." "Bannon?" The maester, regaining some composure, cleared his throat. "If I may, these symbols, they're unlike anything I've studied, but I can make sketches and attempt a partial decipherment. Even if we can't interpret them fully, we might detect a pattern. If the symbols repeat in certain sequences, it could indicate a binding ritual. Such practices existed among the first men, in rare forms of runic magic." Sansa nodded. "Do it, but be wary. If the dragon objects, we leave at once." He nodded, stepping gingerly away from the group to a stretch of wall covered in swirling glyphs. Meanwhile, the two guards hovered near the entrance, pale-faced and tight-lipped, weapons ready but not drawn. Arya and Sansa started to circle around with slow caution, aiming to see if there was a path deeper into the darkness. The flicker of lantern light revealed columns and carved walls receding into gloom, a labyrinth of ice that seemed to spiral further underground. Jon remained near the dragon, acting as a tentative bridge between it and his companions. It rumbled softly, shifting its weight, dislodging more ice from its hind legs. The chunks fell with dull thuds, and the sound echoed into the distance. The creature's head swiveled, scanning each member of the party before settling on Jon again. He sensed no immediate aggression, only a watchful vigilance, as though the dragon was letting them explore, for now. Minutes stretched on, punctuated by the maester's muttered observations and the quiet scuff of boots on frosty ground. Sansa and Arya ventured a bit further into the cavern, peering around a massive outcropping of ice. Jon caught glimpses of their silhouettes in the lantern light. Once, Arya waved him over, but he stayed put, unwilling to lose the dragon's trust by moving away too suddenly. So they continued their silent reconnaissance, and Jon tried to remain calm under the dragon's imposing gaze. Eventually, Arya and Sansa returned, faces etched with worry. Sansa kept her voice low. "It goes farther back than we anticipated. There's a narrow fissure in the rock leading downward. We can hear water rushing below. It might be part of the hot springs or an underground river. The path is too tight for the dragon, but we spotted more carvings. One chamber had pillars that might be carved from bedrock, not ice. Bell. Arya nodded. We'd need more time to explore it properly, but it's definitely bigger than one might guess. If the old Starks sealed this dragon, they could have hidden the key to that seal somewhere in those depths. Jon weighed the risk. We can't venture too deep without ropes, additional lanterns, and time. The dragon might become restless if we vanish. Also, these guards might not handle a prolonged excursion well. They look like they're on the verge of fleeing as it is. Sansa pursed her lips. We'll have to plan a second expedition more thorough. For now, let's gather what information we can from the upper runes. Then we'll retreat and make better preparations. They turned to the maester, who was busily sketching with numb fingers, his breath fogging as he carefully copied each glyph onto parchment. When he saw them approach, he spoke in a hushed, excited tone. These carvings, truly remarkable. Some lines seem reminiscent of the script used by the first men, but interwoven with symbols I've never seen. This might predate the long night. Look here. This swirl could represent the sun's path, and these jagged lines might be stylized mountains. If so, it suggests a cycle, perhaps of warming and cooling. And here, he pointed to a cluster of concentric circles. This could indicate a boundary or seal. Sansa's heart quickened. A seal, as in a magical binding. The maester's eyes lit with the spark of discovery. Potentially, but I'd need more time and references to older scripts to confirm. Still, this pattern. He traced a shape with his quill. It appears multiple times, always near depictions of a dragon. It might be an emblem of binding or entrapment. If so, we might glean how it was done. Men? Oh. Didn't. Arya exhaled, glancing at Jon. That could be the key. If we know how they sealed it, perhaps we can break that seal intentionally and guide the dragon out at our choosing, preventing a violent escape. Jon blinked. Yes. That might be safer. If we do it carefully, we can lead it out where there's space, away from the castle walls. But we must be certain we can control the process. Otherwise, we risk unleashing it in the heart of Winterfell. Sansa looked at the dragon, which remained still, regal, as though listening to their every word. We have no idea how it will respond once fully free. But at least if we manage the unbinding ourselves, we have a chance of reducing the damage. Let's see what the maester can decipher. We may have to attempt some archaic ritual, if that's truly how the old Starks contained it. The maester bowed his head quickly. I'll do all I can. I'll need time to transcribe, to cross-reference with any tomes in Winterfell's library that might refer to the first men's runic practices. I can't promise success, but I'll try. Maester. Arya pressed her lips tight. Then we retreat for now. I doubt we'll learn more just by standing around here, and these guards won't last much longer in this cold. They gathered themselves. Jon carefully moved away from the dragon, keeping eye contact until the last moment. The creature's gaze followed him but made no move to block their departure. The entire group inched back toward the passage. One guard nearly slipped, letting out a startled yelp which echoed through the cavern. The dragon uttered a low growl, but did not pursue. Ice crackled beneath its talons as it shifted into a more comfortable position, dismissing the interlopers. At the threshold leading up to the crypts, they paused, hearts pounding. The maester's face was flushed from cold and exhilaration. The guards looked as if they'd witnessed a demon from old legends. Sansa cast one final glance at the dragon, then nodded to Jon. They climbed, step by weary step, until they reached the main crypt. The warm-ish air felt like a blessing. Each of them exhaled shakily, exchanging looks of disbelief and muted fear. As they walked toward the exit, the maester finally found his voice. To think such a being lies beneath Winterfell. It beggars belief. If this knowledge got out, Sansa silenced him with a stern look. It will not get out, maester. This is an absolute secret for now. The realm has too many ambitious lords and frightened small folk. A rumor like this could spark chaos. He bent his head. Understood, my lady. My notes remain private. Mender Bensiga. Arya slumped against the crypt wall, removing her hood for a moment to wipe sweat from her brow. despite the cold tension had left her sweating. At least, we have a direction now. We search for knowledge on how the old Starks bound or contained it. Then we see if we can carefully unbind it. That's more than we had yesterday. Jon nodded, though worry churned in his gut. We must move swiftly. The dragon's nearly free, and I doubt it will appreciate the final remnants of its prison if it decides it wants out now. At least we have a plan. Let's wander. Sansa led them out of the crypt. The guards posted outside stiffened at their return, but asked no questions. The 6 of them trudged into the castle corridors, where faint sunlight filtered through narrow windows, illuminating drifting specks of dust. Already, the warmth felt foreign compared to that deathly chill below. Jon noticed the maester's fingers trembling around his parchment, and realized his own hands had not yet stopped shaking. They parted ways discreetly. The maester headed for his chambers, presumably to pore over the notes, and begin cross-referencing what few ancient tomes Winterfell held. Sansa and Arya pulled the 2 loyal guards aside, cautioning them to speak to no one. Jon remained alone for a moment, leaning against a wall. Ghost emerged from a shadowy nook, as though waiting for him, and pressed a cold nose to Jon's gloved hand in silent concern. Jon managed a weak smile, patting the direwolf's head. "We'll figure this out," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. The precariousness of the situation weighed on him like a leaden cloak. One wrong move, a false step, an ill-timed noise, and the might of an ice dragon would come crashing upon their heads. He made his way to his chamber, ignoring the curious glance of a passing servant. Once inside, he shut the heavy wooden door, leaning against it with a ragged breath. The shutters rattled in the wind, and the small fire in his hearth crackled. He allowed himself a moment to think of simpler times, back when the greatest concern had been training with wooden swords in the courtyard, or dealing with small household squabbles. Now his concerns were far greater: whether an ancient, primordial dragon would rise from the depths to reshape Winterfell's fate. That evening, Winterfell's routine continued on the surface, but the tension seethed below. Sansa sequestered herself with the maester in a corner of the library, combing through dusty tomes about the legends of the Long Night and the Age of Heroes. Arya drifted between the training yard and the guards' quarters, ensuring that the men assigned to the crypts remained steadfast and didn't whisper secrets after a pint too many. Jon wandered to the godswood, seeking solace among the snow-caked branches of the ancient weirwood. He knelt at the base of the heart tree, where the red leaves rustled softly in the wind. The face carved in the trunk seemed to watch him with solemn patience. He closed his eyes, trying to still his mind. The presence of the old gods often brought him a modicum of peace, but tonight he felt only the swirl of anxiety. Images of the dragon's glacial eyes haunted him, and a faint echo of that psychic connection lingered in the back of his thoughts. His breath formed clouds in the still air. He whispered a prayer, not entirely sure to whom it was addressed. "If you can hear me, show me a way. Let me protect them. Let me find a path that spares Winterfell." The wind rustled the branches in faint reply. No sudden revelations came, no visions or voices. Only the hush of falling snow. He stayed until the cold sank too deep into his joints, then rose and returned indoors, cheeks numb. The corridors were nearly empty, the few torches guttering in their brackets. Ghost padded at his side, silent as ever. As Jon trudged up a narrow stairway, he nearly collided with Sansa, who was descending, carrying a small lamp that illuminated the shadows on her face. "Jon," she said softly, voice echoing in the stone stairwell. "We found some references, cryptic ones, but something. The maester believes we might be on the right track." His heart lifted with cautious hope. "Tell me." She nodded, beckoning him to follow. They moved to a nearby alcove, away from potential eavesdroppers. She held the lamp close, revealing a scrap of parchment in her hand with hastily scrawled notes. "There's a mention of a binding pact in the earliest histories of House Stark, from long before the Targaryens came to Westeros. It's so old that the details are contradictory, but it suggests that once, a Stark ancestor forged a bargain with the powers of winter. It might have involved a dragon of ice." Jon leaned in, scanning the script, though it was too cramped and archaic to decipher easily. A bargain. Sansa's breath was visible in the lamplight. Yes. Something about a vow to keep the North safe from a great frost demon. The earliest Stark. Forgive me, but the name is half lost. Bound it underground in exchange for peace. The references are fleeting, but the maester thinks it might indeed refer to a dragon. Perhaps that was the great frost demon. Jon's heart thudded. So if there was a vow, maybe there's a way to either renew it or release it in a controlled manner. Sansa nodded. Exactly. The text speaks of a ceremony under the sigil of the direwolf and the weirwood. We haven't found the full instructions, but the implication is that the Stark blood and the presence of the old gods might be key. Something about channeling the land's own power to seal or unseal the pact. Met. Jon felt a tremor of apprehension. I was raised at Winterfell, but I'm no expert in arcane rites. Still, if Stark blood is required, well, I do have Stark blood in me, Targaryen or not. Sansa's lips pressed into a thin line. We might all be needed. Me, Arya, and you. Though I don't know how to enact such a ceremony. We'd be fumbling in the dark. He looked at the scrap of parchment, mind racing. Perhaps the runes in the cavern show the instructions. If the maester can piece them together with these references, we might reconstruct enough of the ritual to guide the dragon out. That might be safer than waiting for it to shatter the last of its bonds. Sansa lowered her voice further. Hell keeps searching. We might have to risk another trip into those deeper chambers soon. But we must be quick, before that beast decides on its own that the time has come. Next to call. Jon agreed, heart pounding with renewed urgency. They parted ways quietly. He climbed the final steps to his chamber, the lamp in his hand flickering with each footfall. The castle had grown eerily still, as if all of Winterfell held its breath. Snow tapped softly against the narrow windows. He let himself into his room where the hearth fire had died down to embers. Ghost slipped in behind him, settling near the corner. Jon sank onto his bed, lamp set aside. He stared at the low glow of the coals, imagining the enormous jaws of the ice dragon yawning open in the darkness below, as unstoppable as a force of nature. Yet now, there was a fragile thread of possibility. A vow made ages ago. A vow that might be renewed or ended in a manner that spared Winterfell. He lay back, exhaustion dragging at him. Another day had passed, and the dragon's presence crept ever closer to release. But at least they had a path to follow, tenuous though it might be. If Stark blood and the old gods were involved, then perhaps there was a reason Jon had been the one to discover the dragon, with his strange dual heritage bridging ice and fire. The night stretched out, the wind's lament rising outside the walls. As he drifted into restless dreams once more, he held on to a faint spark of hope that somewhere in those forgotten runes, or in the ancient blood that flowed through his veins, lay the key to forging a fragile peace between Winterfell and the ancient winter beast that stirred in the deep. Only time would tell if that hope was enough to quell the storm that threatened to break upon them all.